The death of Qin Shi Huang in 210 BC marked the beginning of one of the most dramatic political collapses in Chinese history. The emperor who had unified China through brutal efficiency and unprecedented administrative control died while on an inspection tour in the eastern provinces, leaving behind a succession crisis that would ultimately destroy his dynasty within 3 years. The second emperor, Qin Shi, proved incapable of maintaining his father's iron grip on the vast empire. Court intrigues, particularly those orchestrated by the eunuch Zhao Gao, weakened central authority, while the harsh legalist policies that had sustained Qin rule began generating widespread resentment among the population. The Qin administrative system, built on severe punishments and collective responsibility, had functioned effectively under the first emperor's personal oversight, but without his commanding presence, the mechanisms of control began to malfunction. Local officials, terrified of punishment for any perceived failure, often resorted to increasingly desperate measures to meet impossible quotas and demands. The massive construction projects that had defined the Qin era, including the Great Wall, the Imperial Mausoleum, and extensive road networks, required enormous human resources, with hundreds of thousands of conscripted labourers working under brutal conditions. These projects continued even after the emperor's death, draining the treasury and exhausting the population. Peasants across the empire faced crushing tax burdens and corvée labour obligations that often meant abandoning their fields during critical agricultural seasons. The standardization policies that had initially brought order to the diverse regions of China now felt oppressive to local populations, who had been forced to abandon traditional customs, writing systems, and even weights and measures. The book-burning campaigns and execution of scholars had eliminated many of the educated administrators who might have provided effective governance, leaving the bureaucracy increasingly dependent on military officers and harsh disciplinarians who lacked the nuance required for effective civil administration. By 209 BC, the combination of natural disasters, administrative breakdown, and popular discontent created conditions ripe for rebellion. The spark came from an unexpected source: a group of conscripted peasants travelling to frontier garrison duty who were delayed by heavy rains. Under Qin law, arriving late for military service carried the death penalty, leaving these men with nothing to lose. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, leaders of this group, decided to rebel rather than face certain execution, raising the banner of revolt in Zhexiang. Among the countless individuals swept up in the chaos of the anti-Qin rebellions was Liu Bang, a man whose humble origins made him an unlikely candidate for imperial power. Born in Pei County in the Kingdom of Chu, Liu Bang came from a peasant family with no particular distinctions or connections to the aristocratic networks that typically produced political leaders in ancient China. His father was a small farmer, and Liu Bang himself showed little inclination towards scholarly pursuits or military training in his youth. Instead, he developed a reputation as something of a ne'er-do-well, spending his time drinking with friends and avoiding serious responsibilities. Despite his unpromising beginnings, Liu Bang possessed certain qualities that would prove crucial in the turbulent years ahead. He had an intuitive understanding of human nature and an ability to inspire loyalty among diverse groups of people. His informal manner and willingness to treat subordinates as equals, rather than maintaining rigid hierarchical distinctions, attracted followers who might have been put off by more conventional authority figures. This egalitarian approach was particularly effective among the displaced peasants, bandits, and minor officials who formed the core of many rebel groups during the anti-Qin uprising. By his 30s, Liu Bang had managed to secure a minor position as a pavilion chief in his home county, a low-level administrative post responsible for maintaining order in a small district and escorting convicts to labour projects. This position, while hardly prestigious, gave him experience in dealing with both common people and government officials, skills that would serve him well in later years. It was while serving in this capacity that Liu Bang encountered the event that would transform his life. He was assigned to escort a group of convicts to work on the first emperor's mausoleum, but several prisoners escaped during the journey. Knowing that the penalty for losing prisoners was severe, and recognizing that more convicts would likely escape before reaching their destination, Liu Bang made a decision that reflected both pragmatism and a certain reckless courage. Rather than continue the journey and face inevitable punishment, he released all the remaining prisoners and told them to flee. Some of these men, impressed by his unexpected mercy, and perhaps recognizing that he'd sacrificed his own safety for theirs, chose to remain with him. This small group formed the nucleus of what would eventually become a formidable military force. Liu Bang's entry into active rebellion came in 209 BC, shortly after news of Chen Sheng's uprising reached his region. Unlike many rebel leaders who proclaimed grand ideological goals or claimed ancient noble lineages, Liu Bang's initial motivations were largely practical. He'd already made himself an outlaw by releasing the convicts, and the spreading rebellion offered both an opportunity for advancement and a means of survival in an increasingly chaotic world. His first military actions were small-scale affairs, attacking local Qin officials and seizing control of his home county with the help of local magistrates who had decided to join the rebellion. The early phase of Liu Bang's rebellion revealed both his strengths and limitations as military leader. He was not a brilliant tactician in the conventional sense, lacking the formal military education that characterized many of his rivals. However, he demonstrated an exceptional ability to recruit capable subordinates and delegate authority effectively. His willingness to listen to advice from others, combined with his skill at maintaining unity among diverse groups of followers, allowed him to build a more stable and effective organization than many rebel leaders, who relied primarily on personal charisma or military prowess. Among the key figures who joined Liu Bang during this early period was Xiao He, a former county official who became his chief administrator and would later serve as Chancellor of the Han Dynasty. Xiao He's bureaucratic expertise complemented Liu Bang's leadership skills, providing the organizational foundation necessary for governing conquered territories. Another crucial early ally was Tao Can, a former prison official who proved to be an effective military commander. These men, along with others like Fan Kuai, a former butcher who became one of Liu Bang's most trusted generals, formed the core leadership group that would remain loyal to Liu Bang throughout the coming struggles. As the anti-Qin rebellion spread across China, numerous regional leaders emerged, each controlling different territories and pursuing their own agendas. The most formidable of these was Xiang Yu, a member of the Chu aristocracy whose family had served as generals for the old Chu kingdom before its conquest by Qin. Xiang Yu possessed many qualities that Liu Bang lacked. He was physically imposing, standing over 6 feet tall with a commanding presence that inspired both fear and admiration among his followers. His military skills were legendary even in his early 20s, and he had received the classical education appropriate to his aristocratic background. The contrast between Liu Bang and Xiang Yu extended beyond their personal characteristics to their fundamental approaches to leadership and warfare. Xiang Yu embodied the traditional warrior aristocrat, leading from the front in battle and expecting personal loyalty, based on his noble birth and martial prowess. His tactical brilliance was undeniable. He won virtually every battle he fought during the rebellion period, but his strategic thinking was often limited by his aristocratic worldview and his preference for dramatic gestures over careful planning. The first major confrontation between the various rebel forces and the Qin military came when a large imperial army was sent to suppress the rebellion. Rather than face this threat individually, the rebel leaders agreed to coordinate their efforts under the nominal leadership of King Huai of Chu, a descendant of the old Chu royal house, who had been installed as a figurehead ruler. This coalition arrangement established the framework for what would become known as the Chu-Han contention, though at this stage Liu Bang and Xiang Yu were still ostensibly allies, working toward the common goal of overthrowing the Qin dynasty. The campaign against the remaining Qin forces revealed the different strengths of the two future rivals. Xiang Yu's forces achieved the most spectacular victories, including the decisive Battle of Julu in 207 BZ, where his army defeated a much larger Qin force through a combination of tactical brilliance and desperate courage. According to historical accounts, Xiang Yu ordered his men to destroy their cooking pots and sink their boats after crossing a river, leaving them no option but victory or death. This battle established Xiang Yu as the preeminent military leader of the anti-Qin coalition and earned him the title of Hegemon King of Western Chu. While Xiang Yu was winning dramatic victories against Qin armies in the field, Liu Bang was pursuing a different strategy that would ultimately prove more effective. Rather than seeking decisive battles, he focused on capturing territory and establishing administrative control over conquered regions. His forces moved westward along a southern route, avoiding major Qin strongholds while systematically occupying smaller cities and towns. This approach allowed him to build up his resource base and recruit additional troops while avoiding the heavy casualties that characterized Xiang Yu's campaigns. Liu Bang's strategic patience was rewarded when he became the first rebel leader to reach the Qin capital region. While Xiang Yu was still engaged in major battles elsewhere, Liu Bang's forces approached Xianyang, the Qin capital, in late 207 BC. The Qin court, already weakened by internal power struggles and the loss of most of their military forces, was unable to mount effective resistance. The third emperor of Qin, who had succeeded Qin Ershi after a palace coup, surrendered to Liu Bang's forces without a fight. Liu Bang's occupation of the Qin capital demonstrated his political acumen and his understanding of the broader implications of the rebellion. Rather than allowing his troops to sack the city, as was customary after capturing an enemy capital, he maintained strict discipline and protected the population from abuse. He also made a point of treating the surrendered Qin officials with respect, incorporating those who were willing to serve into his administration rather than executing them as enemies. These actions helped establish his reputation as a legitimate ruler, rather than merely a successful bandit leader. The fall of the Qin capital did not immediately end the dynasty, as Qin forces continued to resist in some regions, but it marked the effective collapse of centralized imperial authority. More importantly for the future course of Chinese history, it set the stage for the confrontation between Liu Bang and Xiang Yu that would determine who would inherit the Qin Empire. According to prior agreements among the rebel leaders, whoever first entered the capital region would be granted rule over the strategic Guanzhong area, which included the former Qin heartland. Liu Bang's success in reaching this goal first gave him a significant advantage, but it also made him a target for Xiang Yu's ambitions. When Xiang Yu arrived at the capital region with his much larger army shortly after Liu Bang's occupation, the stage was set for the first direct confrontation between the two leaders. Xiang Yu's forces vastly outnumbered Liu Bang's troops, and many observers expected the aristocratic general to simply eliminate his rival and claim undisputed leadership of the anti-Qin coalition. However, the meeting between the two leaders at Hongmen revealed the complex political calculations that would characterize their future relationship. The Hongmen Banquet, as this meeting came to be known, demonstrated both Liu Bang's political skills and the personal dynamics that would shape the coming conflict. Xiang Yu, despite his military superiority, was influenced by advisors who counseled against immediately attacking Liu Bang. Some argued that eliminating a fellow rebel leader might damage Xiang Yu's reputation and make other coalition members question their own safety. Others suggested that Liu Bang could be more useful as a subordinate ally than as a dead enemy. Liu Bang's behavior during this crucial meeting showed his ability to navigate dangerous political situations through a combination of apparent humility and careful calculation. He acknowledged Xiang Yu's superior status and agreed to withdraw from the capital region, but he also managed to secure recognition of his claim to rule the remote region of Hansuk in the far west. This territory, while less prestigious than the Central Plains, was strategically defensible and provided a secure base from which Liu Bang could rebuild his strength. The division of the former Qin Empire among the various rebel leaders created a complex patchwork of kingdoms and territories that reflected both the coalition's diversity and the fundamental contradictions in their alliance. Xiang Yu, as the dominant military leader, claimed the title of hegemon king of Western Chu and established his capital at Pengcheng in the east. He distributed other territories among his allies and subordinates, creating a feudal system that resembled the pre-Qin period more than the centralized empire that had just fallen. Liu Bang's acceptance of rule over Han Cong appeared to represent a significant defeat, as this region was isolated from the main centers of Chinese civilization by difficult mountain terrain. However, this apparent setback actually provided him with several crucial advantages that would become apparent in the coming years. The isolation that made Han Cong seem like an exile also made it highly defensible, allowing Liu Bang to consolidate his power without constant external interference. The region's position at the western edge of Chinese civilization also meant that it had been less thoroughly integrated into the Qin administrative system, making it easier for Liu Bang to establish his own governmental structures. More importantly, Liu Bang's time in Han Cong allowed him to demonstrate his administrative abilities and his vision for post-Qin China. Rather than simply maintaining military control over his territory, he began implementing policies that would later characterize Han rule throughout China. He reduced the harsh punishments that had defined Qin law, replacing them with more moderate penalties that still maintained order but did not terrorize the population. He also began recruiting scholars and administrators who had survived the Qin persecution of intellectuals, recognizing that effective governance required educated personnel as well as military strength. The relative peace of Liu Bang's early rule in Han Cong was interrupted by growing tensions among the various kingdoms that had emerged from the anti-Qin rebellion. Xiang Yu's feudal system proved inherently unstable, as the various kings competed for territory and resources while questioning the hegemon king's authority over their internal affairs. Several of the kingdoms began forming alliances against Xiang Yu, seeing his military dominance as a threat to their independence. Liu Bang's decision to emerge from Han Cong and challenge Xiang Yu's hegemony was influenced by several factors. Intelligence reports indicated that Xiang Yu's position was becoming increasingly precarious as more kingdoms joined coalitions against him. Liu Bang's own military strength had grown significantly during his time in Han Cong, as refugees from other regions sought the stability his administration provided. Perhaps, most importantly, Liu Bang and his advisors recognized that the feudal system Xiang Yu had established was fundamentally incompatible with the unified empire that China had become under the Qin. The opening phase of what historians call the Chu-Han contention began in 206 BC when Liu Bang's forces emerged from Han Cong and began moving eastward toward the Central Plains. This campaign demonstrated the military and administrative improvements Liu Bang had achieved during his period of apparent exile. His army was better organized and supplied than it had been during the anti-Qin rebellion, reflecting the administrative expertise of subordinates like Xiao He, who had used the peaceful period to develop more effective logistical systems. Liu Bang's initial successes in the Chu-Han contention came not from dramatic battlefield victories, but from his ability to win over the populations of conquered territories. His policies of moderate taxation, reduced punishments, and respect for local customs contrasted sharply with the harsh exactions and arbitrary rule that characterized many of the other post-Qin kingdoms. This approach allowed him to consolidate control over captured territories more effectively than rivals, who relied primarily on military occupation. The contrast between Liu Bang's and Xiang Yu's approaches to governance became particularly evident as the conflict intensified. Xiang Yu continued to rely on his personal military prowess and the loyalty of his aristocratic followers, but he showed little interest in or aptitude for the administrative tasks required to govern large territories effectively. His treatment of conquered populations was often harsh, and his tendency to relocate entire populations or destroy cities that had opposed him created lasting resentment that Liu Bang was able to exploit. The decisive victory at Gaixia marked the end of the Chu-Han contention, but Liu Bang's transformation from rebel leader to legitimate emperor required far more than military triumph. The suicide of Xiang Yu in 202 BC eliminated the most immediate threat to Liu Bang's authority, yet the newly proclaimed Emperor Gaozu faced the monumental task of governing a war-torn empire that had experienced nearly 2 decades of continuous conflict. The administrative structures of the Qin dynasty lay in ruins, the economy was devastated by years of warfare, and regional power holders throughout China maintained armies and territories that challenged central authority. Gaozu's approach to imperial governance reflected both pragmatic necessity and his understanding of the failures that had destroyed his predecessors. The harsh legalist system of the Qin had proven effective for conquest and initial unification, but had generated the popular resentment that ultimately destroyed the dynasty. Conversely, the feudal system that Xiang Yu had attempted to restore had proven incapable of maintaining unity or preventing the constant warfare that had characterized the Chu-Han period. Gaozu's solution was to implement a hybrid system that combined centralized bureaucratic administration with carefully controlled feudal elements. The foundation of this hybrid system was the establishment of directly administered commanderies and counties in the most strategic regions of the empire, particularly in the former Qin heartland of Guangdong and the economically crucial areas of the Central Plains. These territories were governed by appointed officials who served at the emperor's pleasure and could be transferred or dismissed without regard for local connections or hereditary claims. The administrative structure closely resembled the Qin system, with commandery governors, county magistrates, and various specialized officials handling taxation, military affairs, and judicial matters. However, recognizing the political realities of his situation, Gaozu also granted semi-autonomous kingdoms to relatives and key allies, whose support had been crucial during the Chu-Han contention. These kingdoms were concentrated in the frontier regions and areas that had been most resistant to central authority during the Qin period. The kings of these territories maintained their own administrative structures, collected taxes, and commanded military forces, but they were expected to acknowledge imperial supremacy and provide military assistance when requested. The most significant of these kingdoms was granted to Han Xin, whose military genius had been instrumental in several crucial victories during the war against Xiang Yu. Han Xin received the kingdom of Chu, which encompassed much of the territory that had formed Xiang Yu's power base. This appointment served multiple purposes. It rewarded Han Xin's loyalty and military contributions. It provided a strong military presence in a region that might otherwise have remained hostile to Han rule, and it demonstrated Gaozu's willingness to share power with capable subordinates. Similarly, Peng Yue, whose guerrilla warfare tactics had disrupted Xiang Yu's supply lines and communications, was granted the kingdom of Liang in the strategically important region between the imperial heartland and the eastern territories. Zhang Ao, who had been king of Zhao during the Chu-Han period and had eventually sided with Liu Bang, was confirmed in his position, while other kingdoms were granted to generals like Yingbu and various members of the Liu family. This feudal component of Gaozu's governmental system was carefully designed to prevent the kind of independence that had characterized the kingdoms during Xiang Yu's hegemony. The kings were required to spend part of each year at the imperial capital, ensuring that they remained under the emperor's direct observation and influence. Their kingdoms were also interspersed with directly administered territories, preventing any single king from controlling large contiguous regions that might serve as bases for rebellion. Most importantly, the imperial government maintained control over the appointment of key officials within the kingdoms, ensuring that the central administration had reliable sources of information about activities in these semi-autonomous territories. The implementation of this hybrid system required careful attention to personnel selection and administrative procedures. Gaozu retained many of the bureaucratic innovations of the Qin period, including standardized weights and measures, uniform currency, and systematic record-keeping procedures. However, he modified the harsh legal code that had made the Qin system so unpopular, reducing punishments for many offences and eliminating some of the collective responsibility provisions that had terrorized local communities. The emperor's approach to staffing his administration reflected his understanding of the diverse skills required for effective governance. Military commanders who had proven their loyalty during the Chu-Han contention were rewarded with high positions, but Gaozu also actively recruited scholars and former officials who possessed the technical expertise necessary for complex administrative tasks. Xiao He, who had served as Liu Bang's chief administrator since the early days of the rebellion, was appointed as chancellor and given broad authority over civilian administration throughout the empire. The military structure of the early Han Dynasty required particular attention, as the emperor needed to maintain sufficient force to defend against external threats while preventing the concentration of military power that might challenge imperial authority. Gaozu established a system of rotating commands and divided military responsibilities among multiple generals, ensuring that no single individual could accumulate enough force to pose a serious threat to the throne. The imperial guards were placed under the direct command of trusted relatives and long-time associates, creating a reliable military force that could respond quickly to any challenges to imperial authority. While establishing these governmental structures, Gaozu faced immediate military challenges that tested both his administrative systems and his strategic judgment. The most serious of these threats came from the Xiongnu Confederation in the north, a powerful nomadic empire that had been expanding its territory and influence during the chaotic final years of the Qin dynasty and the subsequent Chu-Han contention. The Xiongnu had taken advantage of Chinese internal conflicts to occupy territory that had previously been under imperial control, and their highly mobile cavalry forces posed a fundamentally different military challenge than the infantry-based armies that had characterized the recent civil wars. The Xiongnu Confederation was led by Modu Chanyu, a ruler whose military and political skills had enabled him to unite the various nomadic tribes of the northern steppes into a formidable fighting force. Modu's army consisted primarily of mounted archers, whose mobility and firepower gave them significant advantages over traditional Chinese infantry formations. The Xiongnu military system was based on the decimal organization of their society, with units of 10, 100,000 and 10,000 warriors that could operate independently or combine for larger campaigns. Gaozu's initial approach to the Xiongnu threat reflected his confidence in the military machine that had defeated Xiang Yu and his underestimation of the challenges posed by nomadic warfare. In 200 BC, he personally led a large army northward to confront Modu's forces, expecting that the superior numbers and organization of his troops would achieve a decisive victory similar to those that had characterized the final phase of the Chu-Han contention. The campaign began promisingly, with Han forces achieving several minor victories against Xiongnu raiding parties and advancing deep into territory that the nomads had recently occupied. However, these initial successes proved to be part of a carefully planned Xiongnu strategy, designed to draw the Chinese army away from its supply bases and into terrain that favoured nomadic tactics. As Gaozu's forces advanced, they found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable to the hit-and-run attacks that were the hallmark of steppe warfare. The crisis came when Gaozu and a substantial portion of his army were surrounded by Xiongnu forces at Baideng, near the frontier city of Pingcheng. The emperor's situation was desperate, as his troops were cut off from supplies and faced constant harassment from mounted archers who could attack and withdraw before the Chinese infantry could respond effectively. The siege lasted for 7 days, during which Gaozu's forces suffered significant casualties and came perilously close to complete disaster. The emperor's escape from Baideng was achieved through a combination of diplomatic cunning and military deception. that demonstrated his ability to adapt to unexpected challenges. According to historical accounts, Gaozu's advisors managed to establish secret communications with Modu's wife, convincing her that a decisive Xiongnu victory might lead to Chinese women being brought to the steppe as concubines, potentially diminishing her own position. Whether or not this diplomatic maneuver was the decisive factor, Modu agreed to allow the Chinese forces to withdraw in exchange for substantial tribute payments and recognition of Xiongnu control over disputed border territories. The Baideng incident fundamentally altered Gaozu's approach to northern frontier defense and demonstrated the limitations of conventional military solutions to the nomadic threat. Rather than continuing to pursue military campaigns that had proven costly and ineffective, the emperor implemented a comprehensive defensive strategy that combined diplomatic engagement with systematic fortification of the northern borders. This approach, known as the Heqin system, involved regular tribute payments to the Xiongnu in exchange for peace along the frontier, supplemented by marriage alliances between Chinese princesses and Xiongnu leaders. The Heqin system was controversial among Chinese officials, who viewed tribute payments as humiliating acknowledgements of barbarian superiority. But Gaozu recognized that the economic cost of regular tribute was far less than the expense of maintaining large armies in constant readiness for frontier warfare. The tribute payments typically consisted of silk, grain, wine, and other luxury goods that were valuable to the nomadic economy but represented a relatively small drain on Chinese resources. More importantly, the system provided stability along the northern frontier that allowed the Han government to focus on internal consolidation and economic recovery. The defensive infrastructure that supported the Heqin system involved both the restoration of existing fortifications and the construction of new defensive works along the northern border. Many of the walls and fortified positions that had been built during the Qin period had fallen into disrepair during the years of civil war, and Gaozu ordered extensive reconstruction efforts that employed thousands of workers and consumed substantial resources. These fortifications were not intended to prevent all nomadic incursions, which would have been impossible given the length of the frontier and the mobility of steppe armies, but rather to channel potential attacks toward prepared defensive positions and provide secure bases for Chinese military forces. The garrison system that defended these fortifications was carefully integrated with the broader military structure of the Han Dynasty. Frontier commands were rotated regularly to prevent local commanders from developing independent power bases, while the troops assigned to border duty were drawn from various regions of the empire to ensure loyalty to the central government rather than to local interests. Supply lines were established to ensure that frontier garrisons could be maintained without placing excessive burdens on local populations, and communication systems were developed to provide rapid warning of nomadic movements. While addressing external military threats, Gaozu simultaneously implemented economic policies designed to restore prosperity to regions devastated by years of warfare. The emperor's approach to economic recovery reflected his understanding that political stability ultimately depended on the welfare of the agricultural population that formed the foundation of Chinese society. The policies he implemented during his reign established patterns that would characterize Han economic management for centuries. The most immediate priority was agricultural recovery, as many farming regions had been abandoned or severely damaged during the Chu-Han contention. Gaozu implemented tax reduction policies that allowed farmers to retain a larger portion of their harvests, providing incentives for the restoration of abandoned fields and the expansion of cultivation into new areas. The standard tax rate was set at 1/15 of the harvest, significantly lower than the rates that had prevailed during the Qin period, and additional reductions were granted to regions that had suffered particularly severe war damage. Labour obligations were also reduced from the crushing levels that had characterised the final years of the Qin dynasty. The corvée system was maintained, as it was essential for maintaining infrastructure and conducting large-scale construction projects. but the number of days that farmers were required to work for the government was limited to 1 month per year under normal circumstances. This reduction allowed agricultural workers to focus on their own fields during critical planting and harvesting seasons, contributing to increased productivity and rural prosperity. The restoration of trade networks that had been disrupted by warfare required systematic attention to transportation infrastructure and commercial regulations. The road system that had been one of the Qin dynasty's greatest achievements had suffered significant damage during the civil wars, with bridges destroyed, way stations abandoned, and sections of roadway falling into disrepair. Gaozu ordered comprehensive reconstruction efforts that not only restored existing routes, but also extended the network to serve regions that had been incorporated into the empire during the recent conflicts. Water transportation, which was crucial for moving bulk goods like grain and salt, received particular attention during the early Han period. The Grand Canal system that connected the Yellow River and Yangtze River valleys had been damaged by military operations and neglect, and its restoration required extensive engineering work and substantial financial investment. The emperor's administration also undertook flood control projects along major rivers, recognizing that agricultural prosperity depended on reliable water management systems. Commercial policies during Gaozu's reign reflected a pragmatic approach to economic regulation that balanced the need for government revenue with the desire to encourage private enterprise. Market towns were re-established in regions where warfare had disrupted commercial activities, and standardized currency systems were maintained to facilitate long-distance trade. However, the emperor avoided the excessive regulation and harsh punishments that had characterized Qin commercial policy, allowing merchants greater freedom to respond to market conditions and regional needs. The salt and iron industries, which had been government monopolies under the Qin, were initially allowed to operate under private management, though the imperial government retained significant regulatory authority and taxation rights. This approach reflected Gaozu's recognition that private operators often possessed greater technical expertise and market knowledge than government administrators, while still ensuring that these crucial industries contributed to imperial revenues. As Gaozu's reign progressed, the political dynamics within his hybrid governmental system created tensions that would have long-term implications for imperial succession and the structure of Chinese government. The semi-autonomous kingdoms that had been granted to military allies and relatives began to develop their own institutional cultures and political networks, while the directly administered territories became increasingly integrated into the central bureaucratic system. These divergent developments created the potential for conflict between feudal and bureaucratic elements within the empire. The emperor's approach to managing these tensions was shaped by his growing concern about the loyalty of non-Liu family kings and the long-term stability of the dynastic succession. Several incidents during the early years of his reign suggested that some of the kings were developing ambitions that might challenge imperial authority. Han Xin, despite his crucial contributions to the Han victory, was suspected of maintaining communications with Xiongnu leaders and potentially planning rebellion. Peng Yue was similarly suspected of disloyalty, while other kings showed signs of increasing independence from central control. In 196 BC, these suspicions culminated in the White Horse Covenant, a ceremony that established the fundamental principle of Liu family dominance in imperial succession. The covenant, sworn in the presence of the imperial ancestors and sealed with the blood of a white horse, declared that only members of the Liu family could legitimately rule as emperors of China. This ceremony served multiple purposes. It provided religious and traditional sanction for Liu family rule, it warned non-Liu kings about the limits of their ambitions, and it established a precedent for future dynastic legitimacy. The White Horse Covenant was followed by a series of political purges that eliminated the most potentially dangerous non-Liu kings and replaced them with imperial relatives. Han Xin was arrested on charges of treason and executed. while Peng Yue was similarly eliminated after being accused of correspondence with enemies of the state. These actions were politically necessary to ensure imperial security, but they also demonstrated the inherent tensions within Gaozu's hybrid system and the ultimate incompatibility between feudal autonomy and centralized imperial authority. The replacement of eliminated kings with Liu family members created a new set of challenges for imperial governance. Unlike the military commanders who had earned their positions through demonstrated competence and loyalty, the new Liu kings were appointed primarily on the basis of family relationship, and their administrative and military capabilities were often questionable. This shift toward hereditary appointment would have significant implications for the long-term stability of the Han Dynasty and the effectiveness of imperial government in frontier regions. The death of Emperor Gaozu in 195 BC marked the beginning of one of the most precarious periods in early Han history, as the empire faced its first major succession crisis. The emperor's passing came after a prolonged illness that had weakened his ability to manage the complex political dynamics he had carefully balanced throughout his reign. His chosen successor, Crown Prince Liu Ying, was barely 16 years old and possessed neither the political experience nor the personal authority necessary to maintain control over the powerful factions that had emerged within the imperial court and the regional kingdoms. Empress Lu Ji, who had been Gaozu's wife since before his rise to power, immediately positioned herself as the dominant force in the new administration. Unlike the palace women of later dynasties who were often selected for their beauty or family connections, Empress Lu had been Liu Bang's partner during his early struggles and possessed intimate knowledge of the political networks and military relationships that sustained Han rule. Her understanding of court politics was matched by a ruthless determination to protect her son's throne and eliminate any potential threats to Liu family supremacy. The Empress Dowager's initial actions as regent demonstrated both her political acumen and her willingness to use extreme measures to secure power. She began by consolidating control over the imperial guards and the key administrative positions within the capital, replacing officials whose loyalty was questionable with individuals who owed their advancement directly to her patronage. The Chancellor Xiao He, who had served as Gaozu's chief administrator since the rebellion period, retained his position but found his authority increasingly circumscribed by the Empress Dowager's direct intervention in governmental affairs. Empress Dowager Lu's most immediate concern was the network of Liu family kings who controlled substantial territories and military forces throughout the empire. While the White Horse Covenant had established the principle that only Liu family members could rule as emperors, it had also created a system in which numerous imperial relatives possessed semi-autonomous power bases that could potentially challenge central authority. The Empress Dowager recognized that her son's youth and inexperience made him vulnerable to ambitious uncles and cousins who might question his legitimacy or seek to replace him with a more mature Liu family member. The systematic elimination of potential rivals began with Liu Ruyi, the king of Zhao, who was Gaozu's son by a concubine named Lady Qi. During the emperor's final years, Lady Qi had attempted to persuade him to name Liu Ruyi as crown prince instead of Liu Ying, arguing that the younger prince possessed greater intelligence and stronger character. Although Gaozu had ultimately retained Liu Ying as his heir, the Empress Dowager viewed both Lady Qi and her son as ongoing threats to the succession. Liu Ruyi was summoned to the capital under the pretext of paying respects to his deceased father and participating in court ceremonies. Despite warnings from his advisors about the dangers of leaving his kingdom, the young king felt compelled to demonstrate his loyalty to the new emperor and travelled to Chang'an with a small retinue. Once in the capital, he was effectively held under house arrest, prevented from returning to his kingdom, while the Empress Dowager manoeuvred to eliminate him permanently. The murder of Liu Ruyi was accomplished through poison administered during a court banquet, though the Empress Dowager ensured that the death appeared to result from sudden illness, rather than deliberate assassination. Lady Jie suffered an even more brutal fate. Being subjected to torture and mutilation before her execution, in a display of cruelty that shocked even the hardened court officials who had witnessed the violence of the recent civil wars. These actions served not only to eliminate specific threats, but also to demonstrate the Empress Dowager's willingness to use extreme measures against anyone who challenged her authority. The elimination of Liu Ruyi created a vacancy in the strategically important Kingdom of Zhao, which controlled territory along the northern frontier where Xiongnu raids remained a constant concern. Rather than appointing another Liu family member to this position, Empress Dowager Lu made the unprecedented decision to install her own nephew, Lulu, as the new king. This appointment directly violated the White Horse Covenant and established a dangerous precedent for non-Liu family members to hold royal titles within the empire. The promotion of Lulu was followed by similar appointments of other Liu family members to key positions throughout the imperial administration. Liu Chan, another of the Empress Dowager's nephews, was appointed as Chancellor, replacing officials whose loyalty to the Liu family was considered questionable. Liu Jie received command of important military units within the capital region, while other Liu relatives were granted high-ranking positions in the bureaucracy and the Imperial Guard. These appointments created a parallel power structure within the Han government that owed its primary allegiance to the Empress Dowager rather than to the Emperor. The installation of Liu family members in positions of power was accompanied by a broader transformation of court culture and governmental procedures. The Empress Dowager established new ceremonial protocols that emphasized her own authority and reduced the emperor's role in daily administration. Liu Ying, now known as Emperor Hui, found himself increasingly marginalized within his own government, with major policy decisions being made by his mother and her relatives without his input or approval. The young emperor's psychological state deteriorated under the pressure of his powerless position and his horror at his mother's violent methods. The brutal execution of Lady Qi, whom he had known since childhood, particularly traumatized him, and he began to withdraw from court activities and governmental responsibilities. His reluctance to participate in the political machinations that surrounded him further strengthened his mother's position, as she could claim to be acting on behalf of an emperor who was either unwilling or unable to fulfill his duties. The Empress Dowager's control over the imperial succession became even more pronounced when Emperor Hui died in 188 BC at the age of only 23. His death, which may have resulted from illness or possibly poison, left the throne without a clear heir, as the emperor had no surviving sons. The Empress Dowager responded to this crisis by placing an infant on the throne, claiming that the child was Emperor Hui's son, though many court officials suspected that the infant was not actually of Liu family lineage. The installation of an infant emperor provided the Empress Dowager with the opportunity to formalize her role as regent and further expand Liu family control over the imperial government. She appointed herself as Grand Empress Dowager and assumed direct authority over all major governmental functions, effectively ruling the empire in her own name, while maintaining the fiction that she was acting on behalf of the child emperor. This arrangement allowed her to make policy decisions without the need to consult with other members of the Liu family or senior court officials. The expansion of Liu family power during this period extended beyond individual appointments to include the systematic redistribution of territorial control throughout the empire. Several Liu family kingdoms were abolished or reduced in size, with their territories being granted to Liu family members who were elevated to royal status. Liu Tai was made King of Liu, controlling territory in the strategically important Shandong Peninsula, while Liu Tong received the Kingdom of Yan in the northeast, a region that bordered Xiongnu territory and required reliable military leadership. These territorial grants represented a fundamental alteration of the political structure that Gao Zu had established, as they created a situation in which non-Liu family members controlled substantial military forces and economic resources that could potentially be used against the imperial government. The Empress Dowager justified these appointments by arguing that the Liu family had demonstrated greater loyalty and competence than many Liu family members, but her actions clearly violated the principles that had been established to ensure dynastic stability. The military implications of Liu family territorial control became increasingly apparent as the Empress Dowager began to station troops loyal to her relatives in key strategic positions throughout the empire. Liu family kings were allowed to maintain larger military forces than had been permitted under Gaozu's system, while Liu family kings found their own military capabilities restricted through various administrative measures. This shift in military balance created a situation in which the Liu clan possessed the armed strength necessary to maintain their position even if they lost the support of the imperial bureaucracy. The Empress Dowager's policies toward the remaining Liu family kings combined strategic manipulation with direct intimidation to prevent organized resistance to her rule. Kings who demonstrated loyalty to the Liu family regime were rewarded with favorable treatment and allowed to maintain their territories without interference, while those who showed signs of opposition faced various forms of pressure ranging from economic sanctions to military threats. Several Liu family members who had been prominent during Gaozu's reign were arrested on charges of treason or rebellion, though most were imprisoned rather than executed to avoid creating martyrs who might inspire further resistance. The most significant challenge to Liu family rule came from Liu Bang's surviving brothers and their descendants, who retained control over several important kingdoms and maintained networks of loyal officials and military commanders. Liu Jiao, the king of Chu, was particularly influential among the Liu family kings, as his kingdom controlled substantial territory and resources in the economically important Yangtze River Valley. However, the Empress Dowager's systematic placement of Liu family members in key positions made it difficult for potential opponents to coordinate their activities or develop effective resistance strategies. The administrative efficiency of the Han government actually improved in some respects during the Liu clan interregnum, as the Empress Dowager and her relatives possessed extensive experience in governmental affairs and were motivated to demonstrate their competence as rulers. Tax collection became more systematic, public works projects were completed on schedule, and the military remained effective in defending against external threats. These successes provided the Liu family with additional legitimacy and made it more difficult for opponents to argue that their rule was harmful to the empire's welfare. The economic policies implemented during this period reflected the Empress Dowager's understanding of the factors that had contributed to the Han dynasty's initial success. Agricultural taxes remained at the relatively low levels that had been established during Gaozu's reign, while government spending on infrastructure projects provided employment opportunities for displaced workers and maintained the transportation networks that were essential for commercial activity. The salt and iron industries continued to operate under mixed public and private management, generating substantial revenues for the imperial treasury while avoiding the excessive regulation that had characterized the Qin period. Foreign relations during the Liu clan interregnum remained stable, as the Heikin system that Gaozu had established with the Xiongnu continued to function effectively. Tribute payments were made on schedule, and the northern frontier remained relatively peaceful, despite occasional minor incidents involving cattle theft and border violations. The Empress Dowager recognized that external military adventures would be both expensive and risky, potentially providing opportunities for domestic opponents to challenge her authority while imperial forces were engaged elsewhere. The cultural and intellectual atmosphere during this period reflected the Empress Dowager's pragmatic approach to governance and her recognition that scholarly support could provide additional legitimacy for Liu family rule. Unlike the anti-intellectual policies of the Qin dynasty, the Han government under Liu family control actively recruited educated officials and encouraged scholarly activities that supported imperial administration. The imperial library was expanded, historical records were systematically maintained, and educational institutions were established to train future generations of bureaucrats. However, the fundamental contradiction between Liu family rule and the dynastic principles that had been established during Gaozu's reign created increasing tensions as the interregnum continued. The White Horse Covenant had established Liu family supremacy as a sacred principle that was essential to imperial legitimacy. and the Empress Dowager's violations of this covenant undermined the religious and traditional foundations of her authority. Court officials and regional administrators who had sworn loyalty to the Liu family found themselves in increasingly uncomfortable positions as they were required to serve rulers whose legitimacy was questionable according to established precedents. The death of Empress Dowager Lu in 180 BC created an immediate succession crisis that exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the system she had established. Unlike the Liu family, which possessed multiple potential heirs and a clear succession principle, the Liu clan lacked both the numbers and the institutional framework necessary to maintain control over the complex imperial government. The Empress Dowager had concentrated so much authority in her own person that her death left a power vacuum that her relatives were unable to fill effectively. The immediate aftermath of the Empress Dowager's death saw frantic maneuvering among Liu family members as they attempted to maintain their control over the imperial government. Lu, who controlled the kingdom of Zhao and commanded substantial military forces, emerged as the leading candidate to assume supreme authority within the clan. However, his position was complicated by the existence of the child emperor, whose continued presence on the throne provided a focus for Liu family loyalists who opposed Liu clan rule. The conspiracy that ultimately overthrew the Liu clan began to form among court officials and military commanders who had served under Gaozu and retained loyalty to the Liu family despite years of Liu clan dominance. These individuals recognized that the Empress Dowager's death provided a unique opportunity to restore Liu family rule, but they also understood that successful action would require careful coordination and precise timing to prevent Liu family forces from mounting effective resistance. The key figures in this conspiracy included Chen Ping, who had served as one of Gaozu's most trusted advisors and had maintained his position in the imperial government throughout the Liu clan interregnum. His knowledge of court politics and his connections with other officials who opposed Liu family rule made him an ideal coordinator for the resistance movement. Zhou Bo, who commanded the Northern Army and possessed the military strength necessary to overcome Liu clan forces, provided the essential armed component of the conspiracy. The Restoration conspiracy also included several Liu family kings who had survived the Empress Dowager's purges and retained control over territories and military forces outside the capital region. Liu Xiang, the king of Qi, commanded substantial forces in the eastern territories and had maintained communications with other Liu family members despite the risks involved in such contacts. His willingness to commit his military resources to the restoration effort provided the conspirators with the strength necessary to challenge Liu clan control over the empire. The execution of the Restoration conspiracy required careful timing and precise coordination between forces within the capital and Liu family armies in the provinces. The conspirators recognized that the Liu clan's control over key military units in the capital region meant that any uprising would need to achieve rapid success before enemy forces could organize effective resistance. The plan that emerged involved simultaneous actions in multiple locations, with court officials seizing control of the imperial palace, while military commanders eliminated Liu family leaders and Liu family kings advanced toward the capital with their armies. The successful Restoration conspiracy that eliminated the Liu clan in 180 BC faced the immediate challenge of selecting a new emperor from among the surviving Liu family members. The conspirators had acted primarily to remove illegitimate rulers rather than to advance any particular candidate, and the process of choosing Gaozu's successor revealed the complex political calculations that would shape the early Han dynasty's development. The child emperor who had been installed by Empress Dowager Lu was quickly disposed of, as the conspirators determined that his uncertain parentage made him unsuitable for continued rule. But the question of legitimate succession remained contentious. Several Liu family kings possessed credible claims to the throne based on their relationship to Gaozu and their control over substantial territories and military forces. Liu Xiang of Qi had played a crucial role in the Restoration conspiracy, and commanded the largest army among the potential candidates, while Liu Wu of Chu controlled economically important territories in the Yangtze River Valley. However, the court officials who had orchestrated the Liu clan's overthrow were wary of installing an emperor who already possessed an independent power base that might challenge central authority. The eventual selection of Liu Heng, who ruled the remote kingdom of Dai on the northern frontier, reflected the conspirators' preference for a candidate who would be grateful for their support and dependent on their continued loyalty. Liu Heng was Gaozu's fourth son by a concubine named Lady Bo, and his kingdom, while strategically important for frontier defense against the Xiongnu, was relatively small and poor compared to the major Liu family territories. His experience governing a frontier region had given him practical knowledge of military and administrative affairs, but his modest power base meant that he would need to work closely with the court officials and military commanders who had made his elevation possible. The new emperor, who took the throne name Wen, immediately demonstrated the political wisdom and moderate temperament that would characterize his 23-year reign. Rather than seeking revenge against former supporters of the Liu clan or dramatically restructuring the governmental system, Emperor Wen focused on healing the divisions that had developed during the interregnum and establishing policies that would promote long-term stability and prosperity. His approach to governance reflected both Confucian ideals of benevolent leadership and practical recognition of the empire's need for recovery after decades of political turmoil. Emperor Wen's philosophy of benevolent governance began with comprehensive legal reforms that addressed the harsh punishments and arbitrary enforcement that had characterized both the Qin system and aspects of early Han rule. The emperor personally reviewed major criminal cases and frequently reduced sentences or granted pardons to individuals whose punishment seemed disproportionate to their offences. The practice of executing entire families for the crimes of individual members, which had been a cornerstone of Qin legal theory, was abolished except in cases of treason against the imperial family. The emperor's most dramatic legal reform was the abolition of corporal punishments that involved permanent mutilation, including the cutting off of noses, feet, or hands that had been standard penalties for various crimes. These punishments were replaced with terms of forced labour or monetary fines that allowed criminals to eventually return to productive roles in society. Emperor Wen argued that mutilating punishments not only caused unnecessary suffering but also reduced the empire's human resources by creating disabled individuals who could not contribute fully to agricultural or military activities. The reform of criminal law was accompanied by systematic efforts to reduce corruption and improve the quality of local administration throughout the empire. Emperor Wen established regular inspection systems that sent court officials to examine the performance of commandery governors and county magistrates, with particular attention to their treatment of the common people and their adherence to imperial legal standards. Officials who were found to have abused their positions faced removal from office and criminal prosecution, while those who demonstrated exceptional competence and integrity were rewarded with promotions and increased responsibilities. Tax reduction became a central component of Emperor Wen's domestic policy, as he recognized that the empire's agricultural foundation required relief from the financial burdens that had accumulated during previous decades. The standard land tax was reduced from 1/15 of the harvest to 1/30, effectively halving the government's direct claim on agricultural production. This reduction was made possible by the substantial treasury specie reserves that had accumulated during the Liu clan interregnum and the emperor's commitment to reducing government expenditures on non-essential projects. The emperor's approach to taxation reflected his understanding that sustainable government revenue depended on the prosperity of the tax-paying population, rather than on high tax rates that might discourage economic activity. Lower taxes encourage farmers to bring additional land under cultivation and to invest in improvements that would increase productivity over time. The policy also reduced the incentive for tax evasion and the corruption that often accompanied efforts to collect excessive levies from reluctant populations. Labour obligations were similarly reduced as part of Emperor Wen's broader program of governmental restraint. The corvée system, which required adult males to provide unpaid labour for government projects, was limited to 15 days per year under normal circumstances, with additional reductions granted to regions that had suffered from natural disasters or military conflicts. The emperor also established the principle that corvée labour should be used primarily for projects that directly benefited the communities providing the workers, such as local irrigation systems or road maintenance, rather than for prestige projects that served primarily imperial interests. The promotion of Confucian ideals in imperial administration represented a significant shift from the legalist principles that had dominated Chinese government since the Qin unification. Emperor Wen actively recruited scholars who had studied the classical texts and could provide guidance on traditional approaches to governance and social organization. These scholars were appointed to advisory positions within the imperial government and were encouraged to develop educational programs that would train future generations of officials in both practical administrative skills and ethical principles. The emperor's personal behavior exemplified the Confucian virtues he sought to promote throughout his administration. He lived relatively simply despite his imperial status, avoiding the elaborate ceremonies and expensive luxuries that had characterized previous rulers. His clothing and food were modest by imperial standards, and he frequently walked rather than riding in elaborate carriages when travelling within the palace complex. These practices were intended to demonstrate that effective leadership depended on moral character and competence, rather than on displays of wealth and power. Emperor Wen's approach to court protocol emphasized accessibility and consultation, rather than the rigid hierarchies that had characterized both Qin and early Han imperial practice. He regularly met with groups of officials to discuss policy issues, and encouraged open debate about proposed reforms and administrative procedures. While maintaining ultimate decision-making authority, the emperor demonstrated genuine interest in hearing diverse viewpoints and incorporating useful suggestions from subordinates regardless of their rank or background. The gradual reduction of feudal kingdoms' power represented one of Emperor Wen's most significant long-term achievements, though the process required careful political maneuvering to avoid provoking the rebellions that might have resulted from more direct challenges to royal authority. The emperor's strategy focused on weakening the kingdoms through administrative and legal measures, rather than through military confrontation, recognizing that open conflict would be both costly and potentially destabilizing for the entire empire. The policy of dividing inheritances among multiple heirs rather than allowing single succession became the primary mechanism for reducing kingdom power over time. Under traditional Chinese inheritance practices, the eldest son typically inherited his father's entire estate and titles, maintaining the concentration of wealth and authority within individual family lines. Emperor Wen's new policy required that royal territories be divided among all legitimate male heirs, with each son receiving a portion of his father's kingdom along with an appropriate royal title. This inheritance policy had several effects that systematically undermined the long-term viability of the feudal kingdoms. The division of territories meant that each successive generation of kings controlled smaller and less economically viable domains, reducing their ability to maintain large military forces or challenge imperial authority. The creation of multiple royal titles from single kingdoms also increased the number of individuals with claims to royal status while reducing the prestige and practical power associated with such titles. The implementation of divided inheritance required careful attention to the specific circumstances of each kingdom and the personalities of the individuals involved. Emperor Wen's administration worked closely with kingdom officials to ensure that territorial divisions were carried out fairly and that the resulting smaller kingdoms possessed sufficient resources to maintain basic governmental functions. The emperor also provided financial assistance to newly created kingdoms that lacked adequate revenues, ensuring that the policy did not create immediate hardship that might generate resentment or resistance. The economic prosperity that characterized Emperor Wen's reign resulted from the combination of reduced government burdens, political stability, and systematic attention to agricultural development. The emperor's policies encouraged farmers to expand cultivation into previously unused areas and to adopt improved techniques that increase productivity per unit of land. Government agricultural specialists were sent to various regions to provide technical assistance and to disseminate information about successful farming practices that had been developed elsewhere in the empire. Population growth during this period reflected both the peaceful conditions that prevailed throughout most of the empire and the economic opportunities that were available to ordinary families. The reduction in military casualties that resulted from the emperor's peaceful foreign policy meant that fewer young men were lost to warfare, while improved agricultural productivity made it possible to support larger families without reducing living standards. Immigration from frontier regions and neighbouring territories also contributed to population increases in the more prosperous areas of the empire. The accumulation of substantial state reserves during Emperor Wen's reign demonstrated the effectiveness of his fiscal policies and provided the foundation for future governmental initiatives. The combination of reduced expenditures and increased tax revenues that resulted from economic growth created budget surpluses that were carefully managed and invested in productive projects. These reserves included not only monetary wealth but also large stores of grain and other essential commodities that could be used to address famines or other emergencies. The emperor's approach to managing state resources reflected his understanding of the cyclical nature of Chinese agriculture and the importance of preparing for inevitable periods of difficulty. Granaries were established throughout the empire to store surplus grain during good harvest years, providing both insurance against crop failures and a means of stabilizing grain prices during periods of scarcity. The ever-normal granary system that emerged during this period would become a permanent feature of Chinese governmental administration and a crucial tool for maintaining social stability. Emperor Wen's death in 157 BC marked the end of one of the most successful reigns in early Chinese history, but the policies and institutions he had established provided a solid foundation for continued Han prosperity under his successor. The transition to Emperor Jing, who was Emperor Wen's eldest son, proceeded smoothly without the succession crises that had characterized earlier periods of imperial history. The new emperor had been carefully prepared for his responsibilities through participation in governmental affairs during his father's reign, and he possessed both the administrative experience and the political support necessary for effective leadership. Emperor Jing's continuation of moderate policies reflected both his personal commitment to the governmental philosophy his father had developed and his recognition that dramatic changes in policy might destabilize the prosperity and stability that had been achieved during the previous reign. The tax rates and legal reforms that had been implemented under Emperor Wen were maintained, while the gradual reduction of feudal kingdom power continued through the systematic application of divided inheritance policies. The new emperor's approach to administration emphasized continuity with his father's methods while adapting to changing circumstances and emerging challenges. The recruitment of Confucian scholars continued, with increasing emphasis on developing systematic educational programs that would ensure a steady supply of qualified officials for future governmental needs. The inspection systems that monitored local administration were expanded and refined, with more detailed reporting requirements and more systematic procedures for evaluating official performance. The most serious challenge of Emperor Jing's reign came in 154 BC with the Rebellion of the Seven States, a coordinated uprising by feudal kingdoms that had been most affected by imperial policies designed to reduce their power and independence. The rebellion was triggered by specific imperial attempts to reduce the kingdom's territories through administrative measures that went beyond the gradual erosion achieved through divided inheritance policies. Several kingdoms faced the prospect of losing substantial portions of their domains through imperial decrees that claimed legal authority to redistribute royal territories. The Kingdom of Wu, which controlled economically important salt-producing regions along the eastern coast, emerged as the leader of the rebellion under King Liu Bi, who was Emperor Gaozu's nephew and had ruled his territory for nearly 40 years. Yu's wealth from salt production had allowed the kingdom to maintain military forces that were larger and better equipped than most other feudal territories, while Liu Bi's long reign had given him extensive experience in both military and political affairs. His kingdom's strategic position along the coast also provided access to naval resources that could potentially threaten imperial communications and supply lines. The rebellion coalition included the kingdoms of Chu, Zhao, Jiaoxi, Jiaodong, Sichuan, and Jinan, representing a substantial portion of the empire's eastern territories and a significant fraction of its total military resources. The coordinated nature of the uprising suggested extensive planning and communication among the participating kingdoms, while the timing of the rebellion indicated that the kings had been waiting for an opportunity when imperial forces might be unprepared for large-scale military operations. Emperor Jing's response to the rebellion demonstrated both the military capabilities that the imperial government had developed and the political wisdom that had characterized his father's reign. Rather than immediately launching massive military campaigns that might have devastated the affected regions, the emperor attempted to divide the rebel coalition through diplomatic negotiations and targeted military actions. Several of the smaller kingdoms were persuaded to abandon the rebellion through promises of favourable treatment and guarantees that their territories would not be further reduced. The military campaign against the remaining rebel kingdoms was conducted with systematic efficiency that reflected the improvements in imperial military organisation that had occurred since the early Han period. Imperial armies were better supplied and more professionally commanded than the forces that had characterised earlier civil conflicts, while the rebels found themselves increasingly isolated as their coalition fragmented under imperial pressure. The siege of Wu's capital demonstrated the imperial army's capability to conduct complex operations against fortified positions, while naval actions along the coast prevented the rebels from receiving external support or escaping by sea. The decisive defeat of the rebellion within 3 months of its beginning marked the definitive end of the threat posed by powerful feudal kingdoms to imperial authority. The kingdoms that had participated in the uprising were either abolished entirely or reduced to tiny territories that possessed no significant military or economic resources. Their former domains were converted into directly administered commanderies and counties, bringing substantial additional territory under direct imperial control and eliminating the semi-autonomous political structures that had complicated imperial governance since the dynasty's foundation. The aftermath of the Seven States Rebellion saw the implementation of comprehensive reforms that completed the transformation of the Han governmental system from the hybrid feudal bureaucratic structure that had characterized the early dynasty to a more thoroughly centralized administration. The remaining feudal kingdoms were subjected to increased imperial oversight, with their military capabilities strictly limited and their administrative procedures closely monitored by imperial officials. The policy of divided inheritance was accelerated, ensuring that future generations of kings would possess even less power and independence than their predecessors. The death of Emperor Jing in 141 BC brought to the throne his 16-year-old son Liu Che, who had become known to history as Emperor Wu, one of the most transformative rulers in Chinese history. Unlike the peaceful transitions that had characterized recent imperial successions, the young emperor's ascension occurred at a moment when the Han dynasty stood poised between consolidation and expansion. The domestic stability achieved during the reigns of Emperors Wen and Jing had created unprecedented prosperity and governmental efficiency, while the complete elimination of powerful feudal kingdoms following the Seven States Rebellion had concentrated military and political resources under direct imperial control for the first time since the dynasty's founding. The 15-year-old prince who became Emperor Wu possessed intellectual capabilities and ambitious vision that set him apart from his predecessors. His education had been conducted by leading Confucian scholars who had instilled in him both classical learning and contemporary political theory, while his exposure to court politics during his father's reign had provided practical understanding of governmental operations. Unlike Emperor Wen and Emperor Jing, whose reigns had been characterized by cautious moderation and defensive policies, the young emperor demonstrated from his earliest days on the throne an aggressive desire to expand Chinese civilization and establish Han dominance over neighboring peoples. Emperor Wu's conception of imperial authority differed fundamentally from the restrained approach that had characterized the previous 40 years of Han rule. Where his father and grandfather had focused primarily on internal consolidation and peaceful coexistence with external powers, the new emperor envisioned a dynamic empire that would actively spread Chinese culture and political control throughout East Asia. His reading of classical texts had convinced him that legitimate imperial rule required not merely effective domestic administration, but also the extension of civilized government to barbarian peoples who lacked proper social organization and moral instruction. The emperor's ambitious vision was supported by the unprecedented resources that had accumulated during the peaceful decades preceding his reign. The imperial treasury contained vast stores of gold, silver, and other precious materials, while government granaries held sufficient grain reserves to support major military campaigns or large-scale construction projects. The population had grown substantially during the previous reigns, providing both increased tax revenues and larger pools of potential military recruits. Most importantly, the centralized administrative system that had emerged from the destruction of the feudal kingdoms gave the emperor direct control over the empire's human and material resources in ways that had been impossible for his predecessors. The establishment of the Imperial Academy in 136 BC represented Emperor Wu's most significant early domestic reform and marked the beginning of a systematic transformation of Chinese governmental culture. The academy was founded specifically to train scholar officials in Confucian classics and administrative techniques, creating for the first time in Chinese history a formal educational institution dedicated to preparing candidates for government service. The emperor's decision to locate the academy in the capital and to provide it with substantial funding demonstrated his commitment to replacing the informal networks of personal loyalty that had characterized early Han administration with a professional bureaucracy based on educational qualifications and moral cultivation. The Imperial Academy's curriculum was carefully designed to produce officials who possessed both practical administrative skills and the ethical foundations necessary for benevolent governance. Students studied the 5 classics, the Book of Changes, Book of Documents, Book of Songs, Book of Rites, and Spring and Autumn Annals, which provided the theoretical framework for understanding proper relationships between rulers and subjects, the moral obligations of government officials, and the cosmic principles that governed human society. These classical studies were supplemented by training in law, mathematics, astronomy, and other technical subjects that were essential for effective governmental administration. The institutionalization of Confucianism as state orthodoxy through the Imperial Academy had profound implications for the development of Chinese political culture. For the first time since the Qin dynasty's persecution of scholars, intellectual activity received systematic government support and official recognition as essential to imperial administration. The emperor's patronage of Confucian learning attracted scholars from throughout the empire, creating a concentration of intellectual talent in the capital that facilitated the development of new approaches to governmental theory and administrative practice. The scholar-bureaucrat class that emerged from the Imperial Academy represented a new type of governmental official who combined classical education with practical experience in administration. Unlike the military commanders and personal associates who had dominated early Han government, these scholar officials possessed systematic training in ethical principles and administrative techniques that qualified them for complex governmental responsibilities. Their loyalty was based not on personal relationships with the emperor, but on shared commitment to Confucian ideals of benevolent governance and social harmony. The recruitment system that developed around the Imperial Academy established precedents that would influence Chinese governmental administration for centuries. Regional officials were required to recommend candidates for academy admission based on their moral character and intellectual abilities, creating a merit-based selection process that theoretically allowed talented individuals from any social background to enter government service. While practical considerations often favoured candidates from wealthy families who could afford classical education, the system represented a significant departure from the hereditary and personal networks that had previously determined access to official positions. Emperor Wu's economic reforms reflected his understanding that ambitious military and construction projects required systematic mobilization of the empire's resources beyond what could be achieved through traditional taxation methods. The establishment of state monopolies on salt and iron production in 119 BC represented the most significant governmental intervention in the economy since the Qin period, as these industries were among the most profitable in the empire, and their control provided substantial additional revenues for imperial projects. The salt monopoly was implemented through the creation of government-controlled production facilities in regions where natural salt deposits or favourable conditions for salt extraction from seawater provided competitive advantages. Private salt producers were either incorporated into the government system as paid employees or forced to abandon their operations, while distribution networks were reorganised under imperial supervision to ensure that government salt reached markets throughout the empire. The monopoly pricing system allowed the government to capture profits that had previously accrued to private merchants and producers, generating revenues that were essential for financing military campaigns and construction projects. The iron monopoly followed similar organisational principles, but required more complex administrative arrangements due to the diversity of ironworking techniques and the geographic distribution of iron ore deposits throughout the empire. Government iron works were established in regions with suitable raw materials and transportation access, while existing private operations were either purchased by the government or subjected to strict licensing requirements that effectively brought them under imperial control. The standardization of iron production techniques and product specifications that resulted from government control improved the quality and reliability of agricultural tools, weapons, and other iron goods while generating substantial profits for the imperial treasury. Currency standardization during Emperor Wu's early reign addressed long-standing problems in commercial transactions that had resulted from the circulation of various types of coins with different weights, metal content, and regional acceptance. The emperor ordered the creation of new imperial mints that would produce standardized copper coins with consistent specifications, while existing regional currencies were gradually withdrawn from circulation and replaced with the new imperial standard. This reform facilitated long-distance trade by eliminating the complex exchange calculations that had been necessary when dealing with multiple currency systems, while also providing the government with additional revenue through seigniorage profits from coin production. The introduction of new taxation systems reflected Emperor Wu's recognition that traditional land taxes and corvée labour obligations were insufficient to support his ambitious governmental programs. The implementation of property taxes on merchants and artisans extended the tax base beyond the agricultural sector, requiring individuals engaged in commercial activities to contribute to imperial revenues based on their wealth and business volume. These taxes were particularly significant because merchants and artisans often possessed substantial resources but had previously been largely exempt from direct taxation. The establishment of transit taxes on goods moving between different regions of the empire provided another source of revenue, while also giving the government detailed information about commercial activities and trade patterns. These taxes were collected at strategic checkpoints along major transportation routes, with rates varying according to the type and value of goods being transported. The revenue generated by transit taxes was substantial, particularly for luxury goods and bulk commodities like grain and salt that were transported over long distances. Administrative innovations during Emperor Wu's early reign focused on improving the efficiency and reliability of imperial control over the vast territories that comprised the Han Empire. The establishment of new commanderies in recently pacified regions extended direct imperial administration to areas that had previously been governed through local arrangements or military occupation. These new administrative units were organized according to standardized procedures that had been developed through decades of experience in other parts of the empire, ensuring that newly incorporated territories would be governed according to consistent principles and practices. The creation of inspection circuits represented a systematic approach to monitoring the performance of local officials throughout the empire. Imperial inspectors were appointed to travel through designated regions on regular schedules, examining the records and activities of commandery governors, county magistrates, and other local administrators. These inspections focused particularly on tax collection procedures, judicial practices, and the treatment of local populations, with detailed reports being submitted to the central government for review and action. The expansion of the imperial bureaucracy that occurred during Emperor Wu's early reign reflected both the increased scope of governmental activities and the emperor's commitment to professional administration. New departments were created to handle specialized functions such as imperial ceremonies, palace construction, military supply, and foreign relations, while existing departments were expanded to accommodate increased workloads. The recruitment of additional officials was conducted primarily through the Imperial Academy and related educational institutions, ensuring that new personnel possessed appropriate qualifications and training. The development of more sophisticated record-keeping systems enabled the imperial government to maintain detailed information about population, agricultural production, tax revenues, and other crucial data throughout the empire. Standardized reporting formats were implemented for local officials, while central archives were expanded to accommodate the increased volume of documentation that resulted from more systematic administration. These improvements in information management allowed the emperor and his advisors to make more informed decisions about resource allocation and policy implementation. The military reforms that accompanied Emperor Wu's administrative innovations were designed to support the emperor's expansionist ambitions while maintaining the domestic stability that had been achieved during previous reigns. The imperial army was reorganized into more specialized units with improved training and equipment, while recruitment procedures were modified to ensure adequate manpower for both frontier defense and offensive campaigns. The development of new military technologies, including improved weapons and siege equipment, reflected the emperor's commitment to maintaining Chinese military superiority over neighboring peoples. The establishment of military colonies in frontier regions served multiple purposes in Emperor Wu's strategic planning. These settlements provided secure bases for military operations, while also extending Chinese agricultural and cultural influence into previously unoccupied territories. The colonists, who were typically recruited from densely populated regions in the empire's interior, received land grants and tax incentives in exchange for their willingness to settle in potentially dangerous frontier areas and serve in local military units when required. The construction of new roads and communication systems during Emperor Wu's early reign facilitated both military operations and commercial activities, while demonstrating the emperor's commitment to connecting all parts of his empire through reliable transportation networks. These projects employed thousands of workers and consumed substantial resources, but they provided essential infrastructure for the military campaigns and territorial expansion that would characterize the emperor's later reign. The improved communications that resulted from better roads also enhanced the effectiveness of imperial administration by enabling more rapid transmission of orders and information between the capital and distant provinces. The cultural policies implemented during this period reflected Emperor Wu's vision of Chinese civilization as a universal model that should be extended to all peoples within the imperial sphere of influence. The promotion of Chinese language, customs, and social practices in frontier regions was conducted through both governmental initiatives and voluntary adoption by local populations, who recognized the advantages of conforming to imperial standards. Educational institutions were established in newly incorporated territories to train local elites in Chinese classics and administrative procedures, creating networks of culturally assimilated officials who could serve as intermediaries between imperial authorities and local populations. The transformation of the Han military machine under Emperor Wu reached its full potential by 119 BC, when the empire possessed both the resources and organizational capability to undertake sustained campaigns against the Xiongnu Confederation that had dominated the northern steppes for over a century. The systematic military preparations that had characterized the emperor's early domestic reforms now culminated in a series of coordinated offensives designed to eliminate the nomadic threat permanently and establish Chinese control over the vast territories that stretch from the traditional heartland to the western deserts and northern grasslands. The strategic situation facing the Han Empire in 119 BC differed dramatically from the defensive posture that had characterized relations with the Xiongnu since Gaozu's humiliating experience at Baideng. The Heqin tribute system had provided temporary stability, but had also allowed the nomadic confederation to strengthen its military capabilities and extend its influence over neighbouring peoples who might otherwise have aligned with Chinese interests. Emperor Duyu's military advisors argued convincingly that continued tribute payments represented not only a drain on imperial resources, but also an acknowledgement of Chinese weakness that encouraged Xiongnu aggression and undermined Han prestige among potential allies in Central Asia. The appointment of Wei Qing as supreme commander of the northern armies marked the beginning of a new phase in Chinese military organization that emphasized professional leadership over the personal relationships and hereditary appointments that had characterized earlier periods. Wei Qing's rise to prominence reflected the emperor's commitment to merit-based selection of military commanders, as his background as the son of a servant in the imperial household provided no traditional qualifications for high military command. However, his demonstrated tactical abilities during preliminary campaigns against Xiongnu raiding parties had impressed both the emperor and senior military officials, while his personal loyalty to the imperial family was unquestioned. Wei Qing's strategic approach to the Xiongnu campaign represented a fundamental departure from the defensive tactics that had previously characterized Chinese responses to nomadic threats. Rather than attempting to defend fixed positions along the northern frontier, Wei Qing proposed to carry the war into Xiongnu territory through deep penetration raids that would disrupt the nomadic economy and force the Confederation to fight on Chinese terms. This offensive strategy required substantial logistical preparation, including the establishment of forward supply bases, the training of cavalry units capable of operating in steppe conditions, and the development of intelligence networks that could provide accurate information about Xiongnu movements and dispositions. The first major offensive launched under Wei Qing's command in 129 BC demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of Chinese military capabilities in steppe warfare. The campaign involved approximately 40,000 troops organized into 4 separate columns that advanced simultaneously along different routes toward Xiongnu territory. This multi-pronged approach was designed to prevent the nomads from concentrating their forces against any single Chinese army, while maximizing the chances that at least one column would achieve significant success against scattered Xiongnu camps. The results of this initial campaign were mixed, but provided valuable lessons that would inform future operations. Wei Qing's column achieved the most substantial success, penetrating deep into Xiongnu territory and capturing several important camps along with thousands of horses and cattle that were essential to the nomadic economy. However, the other 3 columns encountered various difficulties ranging from supply problems to effective Xiongnu resistance, with one army suffering significant casualties after being surrounded and forced to fight its way back to Chinese territory. The intelligence gathered during this campaign revealed crucial information about Xiongnu military organization and the geographic factors that influenced nomadic warfare. Chinese scouts reported that the Confederation's military strength was concentrated in mobile camps that could relocate rapidly in response to external threats, making it difficult to achieve decisive victories through conventional battle tactics. The nomads' intimate knowledge of steppe geography gave them significant advantages in selecting favourable terrain for engagements, while their superior horsemanship allowed them to avoid unfavourable battles and strike Chinese forces when they were most vulnerable. The promotion of Hua Kubing to senior command positions reflected Emperor Yi Yu's recognition that successful steppe warfare required commanders who could adapt Chinese military techniques to the unique challenges of nomadic opponents. Hua Kubing, who was Wei Qing's nephew and had demonstrated exceptional abilities as a cavalry commander during preliminary campaigns, possessed the combination of tactical innovation and aggressive leadership that was essential for operations in the vast distances and harsh conditions of the northern steppes. Hua Kubing's approach to cavalry warfare represented a revolutionary development in Chinese military thinking that departed from traditional reliance on infantry formations supported by limited numbers of mounted troops. He organized entire armies around cavalry units that were trained specifically for long-distance operations in steppe conditions, with each trooper equipped with multiple horses to maintain mobility during extended campaigns. These cavalry armies carried minimal supplies and were trained to live off the land through hunting and foraging, allowing them to operate far from Chinese supply bases for extended periods. The development of specialized equipment for steppe warfare reflected the systematic approach that characterized Emperor Wu's military reforms. Chinese armorers developed lighter armor that provided adequate protection while allowing greater mobility for cavalry operations, while weapon specialists created composite bows that could match the range and accuracy of Xiongnu archery. The breeding programs that produced horses suitable for steppe warfare required extensive resources and careful planning, as Chinese horses had traditionally been bred for agricultural work rather than military operations in harsh climatic conditions. The decisive campaign of 119 BZ represented the culmination of years of preparation and the full deployment of Chinese military capabilities against the Xiongnu Confederation. Wei Qing and Hua Kubing commanded separate armies totaling over 100,000 troops, supported by extensive supply trains and intelligence networks that had been developed through previous campaigns. The strategic objective was to locate and destroy the main Xiongnu army under Chanyu Yizhixi, eliminating the Confederation's central leadership and fragmenting the tribal alliances that sustained nomadic military power. The Battle of Mobei, fought in the Gobi Desert region north of the traditional Chinese frontier, demonstrated the effectiveness of the tactical innovations that had been developed during previous campaigns. Hua Kubing's cavalry army achieved complete tactical surprise by approaching the Xiongnu camp through a route that the nomads had considered impassable for large military forces. The Chinese attack, launched at dawn when the Xiongnu horses were scattered for grazing, prevented the nomads from organizing their traditional mounted archery tactics and forced them to fight a conventional battle that favored Chinese numerical superiority and disciplined formations. The destruction of the main Xiongnu army at Mobei eliminated over 70,000 nomadic warriors and captured the Confederation's sacred banners and ritual objects that were essential to their political and religious unity. Chanyu Yizhixi escaped with a small bodyguard, but his authority over the various tribal groups that comprised the Confederation was severely undermined by the magnitude of the defeat. Many tribal leaders who had previously supported the Xiongnu leadership began seeking separate accommodations with Chinese authorities, recognizing that continued resistance was futile given the demonstrated superiority of Han military power. Wei Qing's simultaneous campaign against Xiongnu forces in the western regions achieved similar success, destroying several major camps and capturing thousands of prisoners who provided detailed intelligence about nomadic political organization and military capabilities. The coordination between the two Chinese armies prevented the Xiongnu from concentrating their remaining forces against either commander, while the systematic destruction of nomadic camps and herds eliminated the economic foundation that sustained Xiongnu military power. The immediate aftermath of these victories saw the collapse of Xiongnu political unity and the fragmentation of the confederation into competing tribal groups that were unable to mount coordinated resistance against continued Chinese expansion. Several tribal leaders submitted to Han authority and were incorporated into the Chinese military system as auxiliary cavalry units, while others fled westward into Central Asia, where they would eventually come into conflict with other nomadic peoples and settled civilizations. The establishment of Chinese control over former Xiongnu territory required the implementation of new administrative and military arrangements that could maintain imperial authority over vast distances and diverse populations. The creation of new commanderies in the Ordos region and other strategic areas extended direct Chinese administration into territories that had never previously been subject to settled governmental control. These administrative units were organized according to modified versions of the standard Chinese system, with special provisions for the nomadic and semi-nomadic populations that comprised much of the local population. The military colonies established in former Xiongnu territory served multiple purposes in consolidating Chinese control over the northern frontiers. These settlements provided secure bases for continued military operations, while also introducing Chinese agricultural techniques and social organization to regions that had previously been dominated by pastoral nomadism. The colonists, recruited primarily from densely populated areas in the Chinese heartland, received land grants and tax incentives in exchange for their willingness to settle in frontier regions and serve in local military units when required. The exploration and conquest of the western regions represented a natural extension of the successful campaigns against the Xiongnu, as Chinese military forces followed fleeing nomadic groups into the oasis cities and desert routes that connected China with Central Asia and the distant civilizations of Persia and the Mediterranean world. The strategic importance of these territories was immediately apparent to Chinese military planners, as control over the western regions would provide access to valuable trade routes, while preventing hostile powers from using these areas as bases for attacks on Chinese territory. The initial Chinese penetration into the western regions was conducted by relatively small military forces that relied on mobility and diplomatic skill, rather than overwhelming numerical superiority. These expeditionary forces established contact with the various city-states and tribal groups that controlled different sections of the trade routes, offering Chinese protection and commercial privileges in exchange for acknowledgement of Han suzerainty. The diversity of political arrangements in the western regions required flexible diplomatic approaches that could accommodate different forms of local government while ensuring Chinese strategic interests. The conquest of the Fergana Valley in 104-101 BC demonstrated both the extent of Chinese military capabilities and the logistical challenges involved in projecting imperial power across the vast distances of Central Asia. The campaign was motivated by Chinese desire to obtain the superior horses that were bred in Fergana, animals whose size, speed and endurance made them ideal for cavalry operations in steppe conditions. However, the rulers of Fergana initially refused Chinese requests to purchase these horses, leading to military confrontation that would test the limits of Han logistical capabilities. The first Chinese expedition to Fergana ended in failure due to inadequate preparation and underestimation of the distances and difficulties involved in Central Asian warfare. The army of approximately 20,000 troops under General Li Guangli encountered severe supply problems during the long march across desert terrain, while the fortified cities of Fergana proved more difficult to capture than Chinese planners had anticipated. The expedition was forced to retreat with heavy casualties, representing one of the few significant military failures during Emperor Wu's reign. The second Fergana campaign, launched in 102 BC with substantially larger forces and improved logistical preparation, achieved the strategic objectives that had eluded the first expedition. Li Guangli commanded over 60,000 troops supported by extensive supply trains and siege equipment, specifically designed for operations against Central Asian fortifications. The systematic reduction of Fergana's defensive positions demonstrated the effectiveness of Chinese military engineering, while the capture of the capital city forced the local rulers to submit to Chinese demands for tribute payments and access to their superior horses. The establishment of the Protectorate of the Western Regions in 60 BC formalized Chinese control over the trade routes that connected the Han Empire with Central Asia and the Western world. This administrative arrangement recognized the practical difficulties of governing distant territories with diverse populations and political traditions, while ensuring that Chinese strategic and commercial interests were protected. The Protector General, who was appointed by the Emperor and maintained his headquarters at various strategic locations, possessed both military and diplomatic authority over the various city-states and tribal groups within the Protectorate. The southern expansion of the Han Empire during this period involved military campaigns against the kingdoms and tribal confederations that controlled territories in modern Vietnam, southwestern China, and the Korean Peninsula. These campaigns differed significantly from the steppe warfare that had characterized the northern frontiers, as they involved operations in mountainous terrain against settled populations that possessed sophisticated military technologies and governmental institutions. The conquest of Nanyue, which controlled territories in modern Guangdong, Guangxi, and northern Vietnam, required careful coordination between land and naval forces operating in tropical conditions that were unfamiliar to most Chinese troops. The Kingdom of Nanyue had been established by a former Qin general who had declared independence during the chaos following the fall of the Qin dynasty, and it had developed into a prosperous state that controlled important trade routes connecting China with Southeast Asia. The Chinese campaign against Nanyue in 111 BC involved approximately 100,000 troops, organized into multiple columns that advanced simultaneously along different routes toward the kingdom's capital at Panyu. The naval component of the campaign required the construction of specialized river vessels capable of operating in the complex waterway systems of the Pearl River Delta, while the land forces had to adapt their equipment and tactics to the challenges of tropical warfare. The systematic reduction of Nanyue's defensive positions demonstrated the adaptability of Chinese military organization, while the capture of the capital eliminated the last major independent Chinese state in southern China. The incorporation of former Nanyue territory into the Han Empire required the development of new administrative arrangements that could accommodate the cultural diversity and economic complexity of the southern regions. The establishment of new commanderies in Guangdong and Guangxi extended direct Chinese control over economically important territories, while the creation of tributary relationships with local leaders in more remote areas provided imperial influence without the expense of direct administration. The Korean campaigns represented some of the most challenging military operations undertaken during Emperor Wu's reign, as they involved projecting Chinese power across difficult terrain against opponents who possessed advanced military technologies and strong defensive positions. The Kingdom of Wiman-Joseon, which controlled much of the Korean peninsula, had been established by Chinese refugees who had fled the political turmoil of the late Qin and early Han periods, and had created a hybrid state that combined Chinese administrative techniques with local political traditions. The Chinese invasion of Korea in 109 BC involved coordinated land and sea operations that demonstrated the sophisticated logistical capabilities that the Han military had developed through decades of frontier warfare. The land forces, numbering approximately 50,000 troops, advanced across the Liaodong Peninsula and into Korean territory, while naval forces transported additional troops and supplies along the coast to establish forward bases for the assault on the Korean capital at Wangjeomseong. The siege of Wangjeomseong lasted for nearly a year, and required the deployment of advanced siege techniques that had been developed during previous campaigns in Central Asia and southern China. The Korean defenders possessed sophisticated fortifications and military equipment that made direct assault extremely costly, while their knowledge of local terrain allowed them to maintain supply lines and communication networks despite Chinese efforts to isolate the city. The eventual fall of the capital resulted from a combination of military pressure and internal political divisions within the Korean leadership, rather than from overwhelming Chinese military superiority. The establishment of Chinese commanderies in Korea extended Han administrative control over strategically important territory, while providing access to Korean agricultural and mineral resources. The 4 commanderies of Lelang, Linton, Zhenfan and Zhuantu were organized according to standard Chinese administrative principles, but included special provisions for governing Korean populations who possessed different cultural traditions and social structures. The integration of Korean elites into the Chinese administrative system provided local expertise while ensuring loyalty to imperial authority. The financial and human costs of Emperor Wu's military campaigns were enormous and placed unprecedented strains on the imperial economy and Chinese society. The maintenance of large armies in distant territories required extensive logistical networks that consumed substantial resources, while the construction of fortifications and supply bases demanded both materials and labour on a massive scale. The recruitment of troops for frontier service disrupted agricultural production in many regions, as young men who would normally have worked on family farms were instead serving in military units far from their home communities. The expansion of taxation systems to support military expenditures affected virtually every aspect of Chinese economic life and created new forms of social tension within the empire. The salt and iron monopolies provided substantial additional revenues, but also increased the cost of essential goods for ordinary consumers, while new taxes on commercial activities and property ownership placed burdens on merchants and artisans who had previously been largely exempt from direct taxation. The corvée labour obligations that supported military construction projects required farmers to spend increasing amounts of time away from their fields, reducing agricultural productivity and creating hardship for rural families. The debasement of currency that occurred during the later years of Emperor Wu's reign reflected the desperate fiscal situation that resulted from decades of expensive military campaigns and construction projects. The reduction of precious metal content in imperial coins provided temporary relief for government finances, but created inflation that eroded the purchasing power of ordinary citizens and disrupted commercial transactions throughout the empire. The circulation of debased currency alongside older coins with higher metal content created complex exchange problems that complicated trade and contributed to economic instability. The human casualties of the frontier campaigns were substantial and affected communities throughout the Chinese heartland, as well as the newly conquered territories. Military service in distant and dangerous frontier regions resulted in high casualty rates from both combat and disease, while the harsh conditions of steppe and desert warfare took additional tolls on Chinese troops who were not accustomed to such environments. The recruitment of replacement troops required continuous drafts that removed young men from agricultural communities already struggling with labour shortages and economic pressures. The social disruption caused by prolonged military campaigns extended beyond the immediate effects of casualties and recruitment to include the breakdown of traditional family and community structures in many regions. The absence of young men for extended periods of military service left many families dependent on women, children, and elderly relatives for agricultural labour, while the uncertainty about whether soldiers would return alive created psychological stress and economic insecurity for their dependents. The settlement of military veterans in frontier colonies removed experienced farmers from their home communities while requiring them to adapt to unfamiliar environments and agricultural conditions. The gradual depletion of state resources that occurred during the final decades of Emperor Wu's reign created fiscal pressures that would influence imperial policy for generations. The enormous expenses of maintaining military forces in distant territories, combined with the costs of construction projects and administrative expansion, consumed the treasury reserves that had been accumulated during the peaceful reigns of Emperors Wen and Jing. The imperial government was forced to implement increasingly desperate fiscal measures, including the sale of official positions and titles, to generate the revenues necessary for continued military operations. The emergence of popular discontent in various regions of the empire reflected the cumulative effects of heavy taxation, military recruitment, and economic disruption that had characterized the later years of Emperor Wu Yu's reign. Local rebellions and bandit activities increased as communities struggled with the burdens imposed by imperial policies, while the quality of local administration declined as experienced officials were transferred to frontier duties and replaced by less qualified personnel. The maintenance of domestic order required the deployment of military forces that were desperately needed for frontier defense, creating a cycle of resource allocation problems that would plague the imperial government for decades. The death of Emperor Wu in 87 BC marked the end of an era of unprecedented expansion and military glory, but it also left the Han Dynasty facing a succession crisis that would test the very foundations of imperial government. The emperor's final years had been marked by increasing paranoia and harsh policies that had alienated many court officials and regional administrators, while the enormous costs of his military campaigns had drained the imperial treasury and created widespread economic hardship throughout the empire. The designated heir, Crown Prince Liu Ju, had been forced to commit suicide in 91 BC following accusations of witchcraft and rebellion, leaving the succession uncertain and creating opportunities for various court factions to advance their own candidates. The young prince who eventually ascended the throne as Emperor Zhao was only 8 years old, making effective governance impossible without a strong regency arrangement. The boy emperor Liu Fuling was Emperor Wu Yu's youngest son by Lady Zhao, whose execution shortly after giving birth had been ordered by the emperor himself to prevent the emergence of another powerful empress dowager like Lu Ji. This brutal precaution reflected Emperor W Yu's understanding of the dangers posed by ambitious imperial relatives, but it also meant that the new emperor lacked maternal family connections that might have provided political support during his minority. The regency established for Emperor Zhao was dominated by Huo Guang, half-brother of the famous general Huo Kubing, who had distinguished himself during the later Xiongnu campaigns. Huo Guang's appointment as regent reflected both his demonstrated administrative competence and his lack of independent political ambitions that might have threatened the Liu family's continued rule. Unlike previous regents who'd used their positions to advance family interests or accumulate personal power, Huo Guang appeared genuinely committed to preserving imperial authority for the legitimate heir, while implementing policies that would address the crisis conditions inherited from Emperor W Yu's reign. The immediate challenges facing the new administration were overwhelming in their scope and complexity. The imperial treasury was virtually empty after decades of expensive military campaigns, while the tax burden on the population had reached levels that threatened social stability throughout the empire. Agricultural production had declined in many regions due to the heavy recruitment of farmers for military service, while the currency debasement of Emperor W Yu's later years had created inflation and commercial disruption that affected every aspect of economic life. The frontier territories conquered during the previous reign required continued military occupation and administrative support that consumed resources the government could no longer afford. Huo Guang's approach to these crisis conditions demonstrated remarkable political wisdom and administrative skill. Rather than attempting to maintain all of Emperor W Yu's expensive policies and territorial commitments, the regent implemented a systematic program of retrenchment that reduced government expenditures while preserving the most essential elements of imperial authority. Military forces in the most distant and expensive frontier regions were withdrawn or reduced, While diplomatic arrangements were negotiated with local rulers who agreed to maintain nominal allegiance to the Han Empire in exchange for reduced Chinese military presence. The abandonment of several commanderies in the Korean Peninsula and Central Asia represented a pragmatic recognition that the costs of maintaining direct Chinese control over these territories exceeded their strategic value under current circumstances. The 4 Korean commanderies established during Emperor Yu Yu's reign were consolidated into 2, with Lintun and Zhenfan being eliminated and their territories either abandoned or transferred to the remaining commanderies of Lelang and Xuantu. Similarly, several of the most remote outposts in the western regions were closed, with their garrisons being transferred to more defensible positions closer to the Chinese heartland. The reduction of military expenditures was accompanied by comprehensive tax reforms designed to provide relief for the agricultural population while maintaining sufficient government revenue for essential functions. The salt and iron monopolies that had been established during Emperor Yu's reign were maintained, but were administered more efficiently to reduce their burden on consumers while preserving their contribution to imperial finances. The various commercial taxes and property assessments that had been implemented to support military campaigns were either eliminated or substantially reduced, providing immediate relief for merchants and artisans who had been struggling under the previous tax burden. The restoration of agricultural productivity required systematic attention to the factors that had caused rural decline during the previous reign. The reduction of military recruitment allowed more young men to remain in their home communities and contribute to agricultural labour, while the elimination of expensive construction projects reduced the corvée obligations that had forced farmers to abandon their fields during critical planting and harvesting seasons. The imperial government also provided seed grain and agricultural tools to regions that had been particularly affected by military recruitment and economic disruption, enabling faster recovery of productive capacity. The currency reforms implemented during Huo Guang's regency addressed the inflation and commercial disruption that had resulted from the debasement policies of Emperor Yu's later years. New coins were minted with higher precious metal content and standardized specifications, while the circulation of debased currency was gradually reduced through government purchase programs that exchanged old coins for new ones at favorable rates. These measures restored confidence in imperial currency and facilitated the resumption of normal commercial activities throughout the empire. The administrative reforms of this period focused on improving the quality and efficiency of local government while reducing the corruption and incompetence that had characterized many regional administrations during the chaotic final years of Emperor Yu Yu's reign. The inspection system that monitored local officials was strengthened and regularized, with more systematic procedures for evaluating performance and more severe penalties for officials who abused their positions or failed to meet their responsibilities. The recruitment of new officials emphasized moral character and administrative competence over personal connections or family background, reflecting the influence of Confucian ideals on governmental policy. The death of Emperor Zhao in 74 BC at the age of only 21 created another succession crisis that tested Huo Guang's political skill and commitment to dynastic stability. The emperor had died without leaving an heir, and the selection of his successor required careful consideration of the various Liu family members who possessed legitimate claims to the throne. The regent's choice of Liu He, the king of Changyi and grandson of Emperor Wu, initially appeared to provide continuity with the previous reign, while ensuring that the new emperor would be old enough to assume active governmental responsibilities. However, Liu He's brief reign of only 27 days revealed serious character flaws that made him unsuitable for imperial leadership. The new emperor demonstrated a complete lack of understanding of proper imperial behavior, engaging in frivolous activities and making inappropriate appointments that scandalized court officials and threatened the dignity of imperial authority. His transportation of over 200 followers from his former kingdom to the imperial capital, along with his apparent intention to replace established court officials with his personal associates, suggested that he viewed the throne as an opportunity for personal indulgence rather than as a position of serious governmental responsibility. Huoguang's decision to depose Liu He and replace him with another Liu family member demonstrated both the regent's commitment to dynastic stability and his willingness to take extraordinary measures to preserve imperial authority. The deposition was accomplished through a carefully orchestrated court ceremony in which senior officials formally presented evidence of the emperor's unfitness for rule and requested his removal from the throne. This unprecedented action was justified by Confucian principles that emphasized the moral obligations of imperial leadership and the legitimate authority of ministers to oppose rulers who violated these principles. The selection of Liu Bingyi as the new emperor represented one of the most remarkable elevation stories in Chinese imperial history. The future Emperor Xuan was a great-grandson of Emperor Wu, who had been imprisoned as an infant following his grandfather's involvement in the witchcraft scandal that had destroyed Crown Prince Liu Ju. He had grown up in prison and later lived as a commoner in the capital, receiving a classical education but possessing no political connections or expectations of imperial advancement. His selection by Huoguang reflected the regent's preference for a candidate who would be grateful for elevation and dependent on continued ministerial support. Emperor Xuan's assumption of power in 74 BC marked the beginning of a remarkable period of recovery and consolidation that demonstrated the resilience of Han governmental institutions and the effectiveness of moderate policies in addressing the crisis conditions inherited from Emperor Wu's reign. The new emperor possessed both the classical education necessary for understanding governmental principles and the practical experience of ordinary life that gave him insight into the needs and concerns of common people. His reign would prove to be one of the most successful in Han history, combining effective domestic administration with carefully managed foreign relations that restored imperial prestige without the ruinous expenses of Emperor Wu's military campaigns. The early years of Emperor Xuan's reign were characterized by continued reliance on Huoguang's guidance and administrative expertise, as the emperor recognized that his lack of court experience made him dependent on the regent's knowledge of governmental procedures and political relationships. This arrangement worked effectively because both men shared a commitment to moderate policies and gradual reform, rather than dramatic changes that might destabilize the recovery process that was already underway. The emperor's willingness to learn from experienced advisors while gradually assuming greater personal authority demonstrated the political wisdom that would characterize his entire reign. The systematic restoration of governmental efficiency during this period involved comprehensive reforms of administrative procedures and personnel policies that addressed the corruption and incompetence that had developed during the chaotic final years of Emperor Wu's reign. The examination system for selecting officials was expanded and refined, with more rigorous testing of candidates' knowledge of classical texts and administrative principles. The promotion and evaluation procedures for existing officials were systematized to ensure that advancement was based on demonstrated competence and moral character, rather than on personal connections or political favoritism. The economic policies implemented during Emperor Xuan's early reign continued the moderate approach that had been established during the Regency, with emphasis on reducing government burdens while maintaining sufficient revenue for essential functions. The agricultural tax rates remained at the reduced levels that had been established following Emperor Wu's death, while the salt and iron monopolies were administered more efficiently to minimize their impact on consumers. The restoration of agricultural productivity was supported through government programs that provided technical assistance and financial support to farmers in regions that had been particularly affected by the previous reign's military campaigns. The gradual improvement in economic conditions throughout the empire reflected both the effectiveness of moderate policies and the natural recovery that occurred when the expensive military campaigns of Emperor Wu's reign were discontinued. Population growth resumed in many regions as young men were no longer being recruited for distant military service, while agricultural production increased as farmers were able to focus on their fields without the disruption of excessive corvée obligations. Commercial activity expanded as currency stability was restored and transportation networks were repaired and maintained. The foreign policy challenges facing Emperor Xuan's administration required careful balance between maintaining Chinese prestige and avoiding the expensive military commitments that had characterized the previous reign. The Xiongnu Confederation, while weakened by Emperor Wu Yu's campaigns, remained a potential threat along the northern frontier and required continued diplomatic attention to prevent the resumption of large-scale raiding activities. The various kingdoms and city-states in the western regions needed ongoing Chinese support to maintain their allegiance, but this support had to be provided at sustainable cost levels that would not strain imperial resources. The death of Huo Guang in 68 BC marked a crucial transition in Emperor Xuan's reign, as the emperor was finally able to assume full personal control over governmental affairs while dealing with the political complications created by the Huo family's accumulated power and influence. Huo Guang's long tenure as regent had enabled his relatives to obtain important positions throughout the imperial administration, creating a network of family interests that potentially challenged imperial authority. The emperor's handling of this delicate situation demonstrated both his political skill and his commitment to preventing the concentration of power that might threaten dynastic stability. The elimination of the Huo family's political influence was accomplished gradually through a combination of administrative transfers, retirement incentives, and criminal prosecutions that avoided the dramatic purges that had characterized earlier transitions of power. Several of Huo Guang's relatives were transferred to less sensitive positions, or encouraged to retire from government service, while others faced criminal charges for corruption or abuse of authority that had occurred during their tenure in office. The emperor's approach ensured that the Huo family's removal did not create administrative chaos or political instability, while clearly establishing his personal authority over all aspects of governmental affairs. The consolidation of imperial authority during this period involved systematic reforms of court procedures and administrative practices that strengthened the emperor's control over policy-making while maintaining the efficiency and competence that had been achieved during the regency. The emperor established new procedures for consulting with senior officials on major policy decisions, ensuring that he received diverse viewpoints and expert advice while retaining ultimate decision-making authority. The expansion of the imperial secretariat provided the emperor with independent sources of information and analysis that reduced his dependence on individual ministers or court factions. The cultural and intellectual developments during Emperor Xuan's reign reflected the emperor's commitment to Confucian principles of benevolent governance and moral cultivation. The Imperial Academy was expanded, and its curriculum was refined to ensure that future officials possessed both classical learning and practical administrative skills. The emperor personally participated in classical studies and encouraged scholarly activities that supported good governance, while maintaining the moderate approach to intellectual policy that avoided the extremes of both Qin anti-intellectualism and excessive scholarly influence in governmental affairs. The legal reforms implemented during this period addressed long-standing problems in the imperial justice system, while maintaining the moderate approach to criminal punishment that had been established during earlier reigns. The emperor ordered comprehensive reviews of criminal cases to ensure that punishments were proportionate to offences and that legal procedures were followed consistently throughout the empire. The reduction of harsh punishments for minor offences was balanced by more systematic enforcement of laws against corruption and abuse of authority by government officials. The gradual emergence of new social and economic problems during the later years of Emperor Xuan's reign foreshadowed the challenges that would increasingly plague the Han Dynasty in subsequent decades. The concentration of land ownership in the hands of wealthy families began to create problems for small farmers who found themselves unable to compete with large estates that employed more efficient production methods and possessed better access to markets. The growth of commercial activities, while generally beneficial for the economy, also create new forms of social inequality and tension between traditional agricultural communities and emerging merchant classes. The increasing complexity of imperial administration as the empire grew in size and sophistication created new challenges for maintaining effective governmental control over distant territories and diverse populations. The recruitment and training of sufficient numbers of qualified officials became more difficult as the scope of governmental responsibilities expanded, while the coordination of policies across different regions required more sophisticated communication and supervision systems. The emperor's administration implemented various reforms to address these challenges, but the fundamental tensions between centralized authority and local autonomy remained unresolved. The natural disasters that occurred with increasing frequency during this period placed additional strains on imperial resources and tested the government's ability to respond effectively to emergency situations. Floods along the Yellow River affected agricultural production in some of the empire's most important farming regions, while droughts in other areas created food shortages that required government intervention to prevent famine. The imperial administration's response to these disasters demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of Han governmental institutions in addressing large-scale emergencies. The emergence of powerful court factions during the later years of Emperor Zhuan's reign reflected the natural tendency of political systems to develop competing interest groups as they mature and become more complex. Various groups of officials and their supporters began to form alliances based on shared policy preferences, regional origins, or personal relationships, creating new forms of political competition that would increasingly influence imperial decision-making. The emperor's efforts to manage these factions while maintaining his personal authority required considerable political skill and would set important precedents for his successors. The death of Emperor II in 1 BC precipitated the final crisis of the Western Han dynasty, as the young emperor's demise without an heir left the imperial succession in the hands of court factions whose competing ambitions would ultimately destroy the Liu family's hold on power. The emperor's brief reign had been marked by his controversial relationship with Dong Xian, a court favourite whose elevation to high office had scandalised traditional officials and created deep divisions within the imperial administration. More significantly, Emperor Ai's reign had witnessed the continued concentration of land ownership among wealthy families and the growing impoverishment of small farmers, problems that successive emperors had failed to address effectively, despite their recognition of the mounting social tensions. The selection of the infant Liu Ying as Emperor Ping represented a desperate attempt by the remaining Liu family members to maintain dynastic control, but the 2-year-old emperor's complete dependence on regents created opportunities for ambitious court officials to accumulate power that would ultimately prove fatal to Han rule. The regency arrangement that emerged from the succession crisis was dominated by Wang Mang, whose aunt Wang Zhengjun had served as Emperor Yuan's empress, and whose family had gradually accumulated influence within the imperial court over several decades. Wang Mang's initial position as regent appeared to follow established precedents for managing imperial minorities, but his systematic consolidation of power and his revolutionary vision for Chinese society would transform him from imperial guardian into dynastic usurper. Wang Mang's background and early career reflected the changing nature of Han court politics during the final decades of Western Han rule. Born into a family that had achieved prominence through marriage connections rather than military service or scholarly achievement, he represented a new type of political figure whose power derived from careful manipulation of court relationships and bureaucratic procedures rather than from traditional sources of authority. His classical education had been thorough, and his understanding of Confucian texts was genuine, but his interpretation of ancient precedents was coloured by his conviction that fundamental social and economic reforms were necessary to restore the harmony that classical texts described as characteristic of idealised antiquity. The gradual accumulation of authority that marked Wang Mang's rise to supreme power demonstrated both his political skill and his understanding of the institutional weaknesses that had developed within the Han governmental system. Rather than attempting a dramatic seizure of power that might have provoked immediate resistance, he systematically placed his supporters in key positions throughout the imperial administration, while maintaining the fiction that he was acting solely in the interests of the Liu family and the empire's welfare. His appointment of relatives and allies to crucial military commands ensured that any potential opposition would lack the armed force necessary to challenge his authority, while his careful attention to legal procedures provided legitimacy for actions that were unprecedented in their scope and implications. The mysterious death of Emperor Ping in 6 AD eliminated the last potential obstacle to Wang Mang's complete control over the imperial government, though the regent's role in the young emperor's demise remained a subject of speculation rather than proven fact. The selection of the infant Liu Ying as the new emperor provided Wang Mang with another minority to manage, but the regent's actions during this period suggested that he had already decided to abandon the pretense of serving Liu family interests. His assumption of the title acting emperor in 8 AD represented an unprecedented breach of imperial protocol that signalled his intention to claim supreme authority for himself rather than continuing to rule in the name of Liu family puppets. The formal establishment of the Qin dynasty on January 10th, 9 AD, marked one of the most dramatic political transformations in Chinese history, as Wang Mang became the first individual to successfully usurp imperial authority from an established dynasty and create a new ruling house based entirely on personal ambition rather than military conquest or popular rebellion. The elaborate ceremonies that accompanied his assumption of imperial titles were carefully designed to provide religious and traditional legitimacy for his unprecedented action, drawing on classical texts that describe the transfer of the mandate of heaven from corrupt rulers to virtuous successors. The participation of court officials and regional administrators in these ceremonies demonstrated Wang Meng's success in convincing significant portions of the imperial establishment that his usurpation represented legitimate political change rather than treasonous rebellion. Wang Mang's vision for Chinese society was shaped by his interpretation of classical texts that described an idealized golden age when social relationships were harmonious, economic inequality was minimal, and governmental policies promoted the welfare of all citizens rather than serving the interests of privileged elites. His reading of these texts convinced him that the social and economic problems that had plagued the later Western Han period resulted from departures from ancient principles rather than from the natural evolution of Chinese civilization. This interpretation led him to implement a comprehensive program of reforms designed to restore what he believed were the authentic institutions and practices of Chinese antiquity, regardless of their compatibility with contemporary social and economic conditions. The land redistribution program that Wang Mang announced in 9 AD represented the most radical economic reform attempted by any Chinese ruler since the unification of the empire under the Qin dynasty. The new emperor declared that all land within the empire belonged to the state and that private ownership of agricultural property was a corruption of ancient principles that had created the inequality and social tension that characterized contemporary society. Under the new system, land would be redistributed to ensure that every family possessed sufficient property to support itself through agricultural labor, while excess holdings would be confiscated and granted to landless peasants who had been reduced to tenancy or wage labour under the previous system. The implementation of land redistribution required the creation of new administrative mechanisms that could survey existing property holdings, evaluate the productivity and value of different agricultural areas, and manage the complex process of transferring ownership from current holders to designated recipients. Wang Mang's government established special bureaus staffed by officials who were trained in surveying techniques and legal procedures necessary for property redistribution, while military units were assigned to enforce compliance with redistribution orders in regions where landowners might resist the confiscation of their holdings. The scope of this undertaking was unprecedented in Chinese administrative history, involving detailed record-keeping for millions of individual properties and the coordination of activities across the entire empire. The resistance that emerged to land redistribution came primarily from wealthy families whose economic and political power depended on their control of extensive agricultural properties. These families had accumulated their holdings over generations through purchase, inheritance, and foreclosure on debts owed by small farmers, and they possessed both the resources and the political connections necessary to challenge governmental policies that threatened their interests. Their opposition took various forms, ranging from legal challenges based on technical interpretations of redistribution procedures to armed resistance organized by private military forces that some wealthy families maintained for protection of their properties. The abolition of slavery, announced simultaneously with land redistribution, reflected Wang Mang's conviction that human bondage was incompatible with the moral principles that should govern a properly ordered society. The new emperor declared that the buying and selling of human beings violated the fundamental equality that existed among all people according to classical teachings, and he ordered the immediate emancipation of all slaves throughout the empire. This policy affected hundreds of thousands of individuals who had been held in various forms of bondage, including agricultural workers, household servants, artisans, and entertainers, whose labour had been owned by private individuals or governmental institutions. The practical implementation of slave emancipation created complex problems that Wang Mang's administration had not adequately anticipated. Many former slaves lacked the skills, resources, or social connections necessary to support themselves as free individuals, while their former owners were often unwilling to provide employment or assistance to people they had previously treated as property. The government's promise to provide land grants to emancipated slaves through the redistribution program was complicated by the resistance that the program encountered and by the practical difficulties of identifying suitable agricultural properties for individuals who often lacked farming experience. The currency reforms that Wang Mang implemented beginning in 10 AD reflected his belief that the monetary system inherited from the Western Han period was both economically inefficient and morally corrupting. The new emperor was convinced that the proliferation of different types of coins with varying metal content and exchange rates had created opportunities for speculation and fraud that undermined honest commercial transactions and contributed to the concentration of wealth among merchants and moneylenders. His solution was to create an entirely new monetary system based on classical texts that describe the currency arrangements of ancient sage kings. The new currency system introduced by Wang Mang was extraordinarily complex, involving multiple types of coins made from different materials and designed for different categories of transactions. Gold coins were reserved for large-scale commercial activities and governmental transactions, while silver and bronze coins of various denominations were intended for everyday market exchanges. The system also included knife-shaped coins and spade-shaped coins that were supposed to represent the tools used by farmers and artisans, symbolizing the productive labor that Wang Mang believed should be the foundation of economic value. Additionally, the new system featured cowrie shells and other non-metallic items that were assigned specific values within the overall monetary framework. The practical problems created by currency reform were immediate and severe, as merchants, farmers, and ordinary citizens struggled to understand the complex exchange rates and to obtain the specific types of money required for different transactions. The withdrawal of existing Han Dynasty coins from circulation created shortages of acceptable currency in many regions, while the introduction of unfamiliar coin types led to confusion and disputes about proper valuations. Many people hoarded the old coins or refused to accept the new currency, creating a parallel monetary system that undermined the government's efforts to control economic transactions. The reorganization of governmental structure that accompanied Wang Mang's other reforms was designed to create administrative institutions that more closely resembled the idealized systems described in classical texts. The new emperor abolished many of the titles and offices that had evolved during the Han period, replacing them with positions that bore names derived from ancient sources and were supposed to reflect the proper relationships between rulers and ministers according to classical political theory. This reorganization extended from the highest levels of central government to local administrative units throughout the empire, creating massive disruption in established procedures and relationships. The renaming of administrative divisions represented one of the most visible aspects of governmental reorganization, as Wang Mang ordered that commanderies, counties, and other territorial units should bear names that reflected classical geographical terminology rather than the designations that had been used during the Han period. This policy required the creation of new maps and administrative records, while officials and citizens had to learn new names for familiar places and adjust to revised jurisdictional boundaries that accompanied the nomenclature changes. The practical confusion created by these changes was compounded by the fact that many of the new names were derived from obscure classical references that were unfamiliar to most people. The appointment of new officials to replace existing administrators was guided by Wang Mang's conviction that governmental competence depended on classical learning and moral character rather than on practical administrative experience. The new emperor dismissed many officials who had served effectively during the Han period, but whose backgrounds did not meet his standards for classical education, replacing them with scholars whose knowledge of ancient texts was more extensive but whose understanding of contemporary administrative challenges was often limited. This policy created significant disruption in governmental operations, as experienced administrators were replaced by individuals who lacked practical knowledge of taxation, military affairs, and other essential governmental functions. The resistance that developed to Wang Mang's reforms reflected both specific opposition to particular policies and general dissatisfaction with the disruption and uncertainty that characterized his reign. Wealthy landowners organized opposition to land redistribution through both legal challenges and armed resistance, while merchants and artisans struggled with currency reforms that made normal commercial activities difficult or impossible. Regional administrators found themselves unable to implement complex new policies with inadequate resources and inexperienced personnel, while ordinary citizens faced increasing hardship as economic disruption reduced agricultural productivity and commercial activity. The natural disasters that occurred during Wang Mang's reign compounded the problems created by his reform policies and contributed to the growing perception that his rule lacked the mandate of heaven. The Yellow River changed course in 11 AD, flooding vast areas of agricultural land and displacing hundreds of thousands of farmers who had depended on river valley agriculture for their survival. This disaster was followed by droughts in some regions and excessive rainfall in others, creating widespread crop failures that reduced food supplies throughout much of the empire. The government's ability to respond effectively to these emergencies was hampered by the administrative disruption that resulted from ongoing reforms and by the resistance that many local officials encountered when attempting to implement relief measures. The emergence of popular rebellions during the later years of Wang Mang's reign reflected the cumulative effects of economic hardship, administrative chaos, and natural disasters that had characterized the Xin period. The Red Eyebrows Rebellion, which began in Shandong province around 18 AD, was initially a localized uprising of displaced farmers and unemployed workers who had been affected by the Yellow River flooding and subsequent economic disruption. The rebels adopted red-painted eyebrows as their identifying symbol and organized themselves into military units that could conduct guerrilla warfare against government forces while avoiding direct confrontations that might result in decisive defeats. The Green Woodsman Rebellion that emerged in the Yangtze River Valley represented another major challenge to Wang Mang's authority, as displaced peasants and former soldiers organized themselves into bands that controlled substantial territories and challenged governmental authority throughout central China. These rebels established their own administrative systems and military organizations, effectively creating alternative governmental structures that competed with Wang Mang's administration for popular loyalty and territorial control. The success of these rebel organizations demonstrated the extent to which the Qin government had lost effective control over significant portions of the empire. The restoration movement that emerged under Liu Xuan represented the most serious challenge to Wang Mang's continued rule, as it combined opposition to Qin policies with support for the restoration of Liu family rule and traditional Han governmental institutions. Liu Xuan was a descendant of the Han imperial family who had survived Wang Mang's purges and had maintained connections with other Liu family members and former Han officials who opposed the usurper's rule. His proclamation as Emperor Gengshi in 23 AD provided a focal point for various opposition groups and created the possibility of coordinated resistance to Wang Mang's authority. The military campaigns that characterized the final years of Wang Mang's reign demonstrated both the resources that remained available to his government and the fundamental weaknesses that made his position ultimately untenable. The Qin armies were often well-equipped and professionally commanded, but they faced the impossible task of suppressing multiple simultaneous rebellions while maintaining control over territories where popular support for the government had largely disappeared. The loyalty of military commanders became increasingly questionable as the prospects for Qin success declined, while the recruitment of additional troops became more difficult as potential soldiers joined rebel forces or avoided military service entirely. The siege of Chang'an that culminated in Wang Mang's death in October 23 AD marked the violent end of one of the most ambitious reform programs in Chinese history. The emperor's final months were spent in his palace compound as rebel forces gradually gained control of the capital city and eliminated the remaining centers of Qin resistance. Contemporary accounts describe Wang Mang as maintaining his scholarly demeanor even as his empire collapsed around him, continuing to consult classical texts for guidance and issuing proclamations based on ancient precedents even when his orders could no longer be implemented. His death at the hands of a merchant named Du Wu, who killed him in the palace throne room and decapitated him to claim the bounty that had been placed on the emperor's head, provided a brutally practical end to a reign that had been characterized by idealistic attempts to transform Chinese society according to classical principles. The immediate aftermath of Wang Mang's death saw the complete collapse of the Qin governmental system and the emergence of multiple competing claimants to imperial authority. The various rebel movements that had opposed Wang Mang's rule lacked the unity necessary to establish a stable successor government, while the destruction of administrative records and the flight of experienced officials made it difficult to restore normal governmental operations even in regions that had been liberated from Qin control. The economic disruption that had characterized the later years of Wang Mang's reign continued and in some areas intensified as competing military forces struggled for control over resources and territory. The legacy of Wang Mang's revolutionary experiment would influence Chinese political thought and governmental policy for centuries, as subsequent rulers and scholars debated the lessons that could be drawn from his spectacular failure. His genuine commitment to social reform and his attempt to address the economic inequality that had plagued the later Western Han period earned him some historical sympathy, while his methods and the disruption they caused provided cautionary examples of the dangers of attempting rapid transformation of established institutions. The Qin interregnum demonstrated both the potential for radical political change within the Chinese imperial system and the practical limitations that constrained even the most ambitious reform programs when they conflicted with entrenched interests and social realities. The chaos that followed Wang Mang's death in 23 AD created a power vacuum that multiple claimants sought to fill, but none possessed the combination of military strength, political legitimacy, and administrative capability necessary to restore unified imperial rule. The nominal Emperor Gengshi, Liu Xuan, controlled portions of the former capital region, but lacked the resources and organizational skills required to extend his authority throughout the empire. Regional warlords commanded substantial military forces but operated independently of any central authority, while various rebel groups continued to control territories they had seized during the final years of Qin rule. The economic disruption and administrative breakdown that had characterized Wang Mang's later reign persisted, and in many areas intensified as competing forces struggled for control over diminished resources. Among the various Liu family members who emerged as potential leaders during this chaotic period, Liu Xue possessed qualities that would prove decisive in the struggle to restore Han rule. A ninth-generation descendant of Emperor Gaozu through the Changsha kingdom lineage, Liu Xue had received a classical education and had participated in the anti-Wang Mang resistance movement, but his relatively modest background and lack of significant territorial control initially made him appear less threatening to other claimants than more prominent rivals. His early military experiences had demonstrated both tactical competence and an ability to inspire loyalty among diverse groups of followers, while his understanding of administrative principles provided him with insights into the governmental reforms that would be necessary to restore effective imperial rule. Liu Xue's rise to prominence began with his successful campaign against the Red Eyebrows rebels in 25 AD, a military operation that demonstrated his superior organizational abilities and strategic thinking compared to other claimants. Unlike previous attempts to suppress the Red Eyebrows through direct military confrontation, Liu Xue developed a comprehensive strategy that combined military pressure with diplomatic negotiations and economic incentives designed to divide the rebel coalition and encourage defections. His forces were better supplied and more disciplined than most contemporary armies, reflecting his attention to logistical planning and his ability to maintain effective command structures even during extended campaigns. The decisive battle against the Red Eyebrows near Yiyang showcased the tactical innovations that Liu Xue developed through his study of both classical military texts and contemporary battlefield conditions. His army employed coordinated infantry and cavalry formations that could adapt to changing tactical situations, while his use of engineering techniques for siege warfare and battlefield fortification demonstrated the technical expertise that his forces had acquired. The complete destruction of the Red Eyebrows' main army eliminated one of the most significant obstacles to imperial reunification, while providing Liu Xue with substantial additional resources in the form of captured equipment and territories that had been under rebel control. The proclamation of Liu Xue as Emperor Guangwu in 25 AD marked the formal beginning of the Eastern Han Dynasty, though his actual control at that time extended over only a fraction of the former empire's territory. The new emperor's decision to establish his capital at Luoyang rather than attempting to recapture Chang'an reflected both practical considerations and symbolic intentions that would influence the character of the restored dynasty. Luoyang's location in the eastern part of the traditional heartland provided better access to the economically important regions along the Yellow River and Yangtze River valleys, while its distance from the former Western Han capital symbolized the new dynasty's intention to avoid the mistakes and excesses that had characterized the later Western Han period. The construction and organization of the new capital at Luoyang required extensive planning and substantial resources, as the city needed to accommodate not only the imperial court and central government, but also the commercial and cultural activities that were essential to imperial prestige. Emperor Guangwu ordered the construction of new palace complexes that were impressive but deliberately more modest than the elaborate structures that had characterized Chang'an during the Western Han period. The imperial palace featured audience halls capable of accommodating large ceremonial gatherings, residential quarters for the emperor and his family, and administrative buildings that housed the various departments of the central government. The city's defensive walls were constructed according to the most advanced military engineering principles, incorporating lessons learned from the sieges and urban warfare that had characterized the recent period of civil conflict. The restoration of imperial administration required the reconstruction of governmental institutions that had been destroyed or severely damaged during Wang Mang's reign and the subsequent civil wars. Emperor Guangwu's approach to this challenge demonstrated both his understanding of traditional Han administrative principles and his recognition that certain modifications were necessary to address the changed conditions that characterized the post-Wang Mang period. The emperor retained the basic structure of commanderies and counties that had been established during the Western Han period, but he implemented new procedures for appointing and supervising local officials that were designed to prevent the corruption and incompetence that had plagued earlier administrations. The recruitment of qualified personnel for governmental positions represented one of the most significant challenges facing the new administration, as many experienced officials had been killed during the civil wars or had fled to remote regions where they could avoid involvement in political conflicts. Emperor Guangwu implemented systematic recruitment programs that sought to identify and attract individuals who possessed both the classical education necessary for administrative responsibilities and the practical experience required for effective governance. The emperor's willingness to appoint officials based on demonstrated competence, rather than family connections or political loyalty, helped to restore professional standards within the imperial bureaucracy, while ensuring that governmental positions were filled by qualified individuals. The military reorganization that accompanied administrative restoration reflected Emperor Guangwu's understanding that the new dynasty's survival depended on maintaining adequate military strength, while avoiding the concentration of armed power that might threaten imperial authority. The emperor established new command structures that divided military responsibilities among multiple generals and regional commanders, ensuring that no single individual could accumulate sufficient force to challenge the throne. The imperial army was reorganized into specialized units that were trained for different types of warfare, including infantry formations for conventional battles, cavalry units for operations against nomadic opponents, and engineering corps for siege warfare and construction projects. The standardization of military equipment and training procedures throughout the imperial army represented a significant improvement over the chaotic conditions that had characterized military forces during the Civil War period. Emperor Guangwu ordered the establishment of imperial armories that produced weapons and armor according to uniform specifications, while training manuals were developed to ensure that military units throughout the empire employed consistent tactical doctrines and organizational procedures. The implementation of regular inspection and evaluation systems for military commanders helped to maintain professional standards while providing the emperor with reliable information about the capabilities and loyalty of his armed forces. The economic policies implemented during the early Eastern Han period were designed to restore agricultural productivity and commercial activity, while avoiding the excessive taxation and disruptive reforms that had characterized Wang Mang's reign. Emperor Guangwu reduced tax rates to levels that were sustainable for the agricultural population, while providing sufficient revenue for essential governmental functions. The land redistribution programs that had created such disruption during the Qin period were abandoned in favor of policies that encouraged agricultural development through incentives for bringing abandoned land back into cultivation and technical assistance for farmers who sought to improve their productivity. The restoration of currency stability required the gradual replacement of the complex and confusing monetary system that Wang Mang had implemented with a simplified coinage that was based on traditional Han Dynasty standards. The new imperial mints produced copper coins with standardized weights and metal content, while the various exotic currency types that had been introduced during the Qin period were withdrawn from circulation through government exchange programs. The restoration of confidence in imperial currency facilitated the resumption of normal commercial activities and contributed to the economic recovery that characterized the early Eastern Han period. The cultural and intellectual flourishing that emerged during Emperor Guangwu's reign reflected both the emperor's personal commitment to learning and the natural recovery of scholarly activities that occurred when political stability was restored. The Imperial Academy was re-established at Luoyang with expanded facilities and an enlarged faculty, while libraries and archives were reconstructed to preserve classical texts and governmental records that had survived the disruptions of the previous decades. The emperor's patronage of scholarly activities attracted intellectuals from throughout the empire and created a concentration of learning in the new capital that would contribute to significant advances in various fields of knowledge. The development of historical writing during this period represented one of the most significant intellectual achievements of the early Eastern Han period. The court historian Ban Biao began the systematic compilation of historical records that would eventually become the Book of Han, a comprehensive account of the Western Han dynasty that established new standards for historical scholarship. This work incorporated not only political and military events, but also detailed information about economic conditions, social developments, and cultural achievements that provided future generations with unprecedented insight into the character and evolution of Chinese civilization. The advances in astronomy that occurred during Emperor Guangwu's reign built upon the observational traditions that had been developed during earlier periods, while incorporating new theoretical insights and improved instruments. Imperial astronomers developed more accurate methods for predicting celestial events and calculating calendar systems, while their observations of planetary movements and stellar positions contributed to the refinement of cosmological theories that influenced both governmental policy and popular understanding of natural phenomena. The construction of new observatories equipped with advanced instruments demonstrated the emperor's commitment to supporting scientific activities that had both practical applications for governmental administration and theoretical importance for understanding the natural world. Medical knowledge expanded significantly during this period through the systematic compilation of therapeutic techniques and pharmaceutical knowledge that had been developed over centuries of clinical practice. Imperial physicians developed new treatments for various diseases and injuries, while creating comprehensive medical texts that preserved traditional knowledge and incorporated recent discoveries. The establishment of medical schools and the standardization of training procedures for physicians contributed to improvements in public health throughout the empire, while the development of new surgical techniques and diagnostic methods enhanced the effectiveness of medical treatment for both common ailments and serious injuries. Technological innovations during the early Eastern Han period included improvements in agricultural tools and techniques that increased farming productivity, advances in metallurgy that enhanced the quality of weapons and implements, and developments in engineering that facilitated construction projects and transportation systems. The invention of paper during this period represented one of the most significant technological achievements in human history, as it provided a writing material that was both less expensive and more convenient than the bamboo strips and silk that had previously been used for written documents. The gradual adoption of paper for governmental records, commercial transactions, and scholarly works would have profound implications for the development of Chinese civilization and would eventually spread throughout the world. The expansion of Chinese influence into Central Asia during Emperor Guangwu's reign represented a careful balance between the desire to restore Han prestige in the western regions and the recognition that expensive military campaigns could destabilize the domestic recovery that was essential to dynastic survival. The emperor's approach to Central Asian policy emphasized diplomatic engagement and commercial relationships rather than direct military control, recognizing that sustainable Chinese influence in these distant territories required the cooperation of local rulers who possessed intimate knowledge of regional conditions and political dynamics. The re-establishment of the Silk Road trade network represented one of the most significant achievements of Emperor Guangwu's foreign policy, as it restored Chinese access to the luxury goods and exotic materials that were highly valued by imperial elites, while providing Central Asian merchants with reliable access to Chinese markets. The emperor's government provided security for merchant caravans travelling through Chinese-controlled territories while negotiating agreements with local rulers that ensured safe passage through regions beyond direct imperial control. The revenues generated by taxes on trade goods provided substantial income for the imperial treasury, while the cultural exchange that accompanied commercial activities contributed to the intellectual and artistic development of Chinese civilization. The diplomatic relations that the Eastern Han government established with distant kingdoms reflected both the restoration of Chinese prestige and the practical limitations that constrained imperial policy in remote regions. The emperor's envoys travelled to kingdoms in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and even distant regions that had never previously been in contact with Chinese civilization, establishing tributary relationships that acknowledged Chinese superiority while respecting local autonomy in internal affairs. These diplomatic initiatives required substantial investments of time and resources, but they contributed to the expansion of Chinese cultural influence and provided valuable intelligence about political and economic conditions in distant regions. The gradual consolidation of imperial control over territories that had been lost or had achieved de facto independence during the Civil War period required a combination of military pressure, diplomatic negotiation, and administrative reform that demonstrated Emperor Guangwu's sophisticated understanding of the diverse challenges facing the restored dynasty. Some regions were reincorporated through military campaigns that eliminated local warlords or rebel leaders, while others were brought back under imperial control through negotiations that provided local elites with positions within the imperial administration in exchange for their acknowledgement of central authority. The establishment of new commanderies and the reorganization of existing administrative divisions reflected the emperor's commitment to extending effective governmental control throughout the empire, while adapting administrative structures to local conditions and requirements. The appointment of capable governors and the implementation of systematic inspection procedures ensured that imperial policies were implemented consistently while providing local populations with effective governance that addressed their specific needs and concerns. The success of these administrative reforms contributed to the political stability that characterized the early Eastern Han period and provided the foundation for the cultural and economic achievements that would define the dynasty's golden age. The prosperity and cultural achievements that had characterized the Eastern Han dynasty's golden age began to unravel during the late 2nd century AD as a combination of natural disasters, governmental corruption, and social tensions created conditions that would ultimately destroy the unified empire that had endured for over 4 centuries. The reign of Emperor Ling, which began in 168 AD, coincided with a series of ecological catastrophes that tested the imperial government's capacity to respond effectively to large-scale emergencies while maintaining the complex administrative and military systems that sustained Chinese civilization across vast territories and diverse populations. The Yellow River floods of 175 AD mark the beginning of a cascade of natural disasters that would devastate agricultural production throughout the empire's most densely populated regions. The river's sudden change of course affected millions of farmers whose fields were either inundated by floodwaters or left without adequate irrigation when the river abandoned its previous channels. The displacement of entire communities created massive refugee populations that strained the resources of regions that had escaped direct flood damage, while the disruption of transportation networks complicated the government's efforts to distribute relief supplies and coordinate recovery efforts across affected areas. Successive crop failures in the years following the initial floods were compounded by locust swarms that consumed remaining agricultural production in several provinces, creating famine conditions that affected an estimated 20 million people across northern and central China. The imperial granary system, which had been designed to provide emergency food supplies during temporary shortages, proved inadequate to address the scale and duration of the crisis. Local officials faced impossible choices between distributing available grain to prevent immediate starvation and maintaining strategic reserves that might be needed if conditions continued to deteriorate. The government's response to these natural disasters revealed the extent to which administrative efficiency had declined during the later Eastern Han period. Emperor Ling's court was dominated by eunuchs who had accumulated unprecedented influence over imperial policy through their control of palace access and their manipulation of the emperor's personal relationships. These eunuch factions were primarily concerned with maintaining their own power and wealth, rather than addressing the empire's mounting problems, and their interference in governmental operations prevented competent officials from implementing effective relief measures. The sale of official positions became a systematic practice during this period, as the imperial government desperately sought additional revenue to fund disaster relief efforts and maintain basic administrative functions. Wealthy individuals could purchase appointments to lucrative governmental posts regardless of their qualifications or moral character, creating a cycle of corruption that undermined the effectiveness of local administration throughout the empire. Officials who had bought their positions were primarily interested in recovering their investment and generating profits rather than serving the public interest, leading to increased taxation, judicial corruption, and abuse of governmental authority. The concentration of land ownership that had been developing gradually throughout the Eastern Han period accelerated during the crisis years as small farmers were forced to sell their property to survive the famines and economic disruption. Wealthy families and corrupt officials accumulated vast estates worked by displaced peasants who had been reduced to tenant farming or wage labour under conditions that provided barely subsistence-level incomes. The imperial government's inability to address this growing inequality created resentment among the rural population and provided fertile ground for the religious and political movements that would eventually challenge imperial authority. Zhang Jiao emerged as the leader of the most significant popular movement of this period, combining religious teachings derived from Taiping Dao with social and political criticism that resonated with millions of suffering peasants and displaced workers. Zhang Jiao's religious system promised spiritual healing and social transformation through adherence to moral principles and ritual practices that were accessible to ordinary people regardless of their education or social status. His message that the Han Dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven due to its corruption and incompetence provided a theological justification for resistance to imperial authority. The organizational structure that Zhang Jiao developed for his movement demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both religious mobilization and military logistics. The Taiping Dao was organized into 36 districts, each commanded by a general who was responsible for recruiting followers, conducting religious ceremonies, and preparing for eventual military action against the imperial government. This decentralized structure allowed the movement to spread rapidly across multiple provinces, while avoiding detection by imperial authorities who were focused on more conventional forms of political opposition. The recruitment methods employed by Zhang Jiao and his associates exploited the desperation and resentment that characterized rural communities throughout the affected regions. Taiping Dao missionaries offered healing ceremonies for the sick, food distribution for the hungry, and spiritual comfort for those who had lost family members to famine and disease. These practical benefits were combined with religious teachings that explained current suffering as the result of cosmic imbalance caused by governmental corruption and promised that adherence to Taiping principles would restore harmony between heaven and earth. The military preparations that accompanied religious organization were conducted with remarkable secrecy considering the scale of the operation. Zhang Jiao's followers manufactured weapons, stockpiled supplies, and conducted training exercises while maintaining the appearance of peaceful religious activities. The movement's leaders coordinated their activities across vast distances through a communication network that relied on travelling missionaries and merchant contacts, demonstrating organisational capabilities that rivaled those of the imperial government itself. The Yellow Turban Rebellion erupted simultaneously across multiple provinces on March 5th, 184 AD, when Zhang Jiao's followers revealed their military preparations and launched coordinated attacks on governmental installations throughout the empire. The rebels adopted yellow headbands as their identifying symbol, leading to their designation as the Yellow Turbans by imperial forces and later historians. The initial phase of the rebellion achieved remarkable success as imperial garrisons were overwhelmed by the sheer number of rebels and the coordination of their attacks across such extensive territories. The rebel forces that emerged during the first months of the uprising demonstrated both the movement's popular support and the military capabilities that Zhang Jiao's organization had developed. Individual rebel armies numbered in the tens of thousands, with the largest forces commanded by Zhang Jiao's brothers, Zhang Bao and Zhang Liang, reportedly including over 100,000 fighters each. These armies were composed primarily of peasant farmers and displaced workers who lacked professional military training but possessed intimate knowledge of local terrain and strong motivation to resist the imperial government that had failed to address their suffering. The imperial response to the Yellow Turban Rebellion revealed both the military resources that remained available to the Han government and the political divisions that weakened its effectiveness. Emperor Ling appointed capable generals including Liu Jie, Huangfu Song and Dong Zhuo to command imperial armies, but these commanders often operated independently rather than coordinating their efforts against the common threat. The competition for imperial favour and the pursuit of personal advancement that characterised court politics continued even during the military crisis, preventing the development of comprehensive strategic planning. The siege of Guangzhou demonstrated the tactical evolution that occurred as both imperial and rebel forces adapted to the realities of large-scale warfare. Zhang Jiao's main army had fortified the city with earthworks and defensive structures that reflected both traditional Chinese military engineering and innovations developed specifically for the rebellion. The imperial forces commanded by Liu Ji employed siege engines and systematic approaches that gradually reduced the rebel defences, but the operation required months of sustained effort and substantial casualties on both sides. The death of Zhang Jiao during the siege of Guangzhou eliminated the rebellion's primary religious and military leader, but the movement's decentralized structure allowed fighting to continue under regional commanders who maintained control over substantial territories and military forces. Zhang Bao and Zhang Liang continued to resist imperial forces in their respective regions, while other Yellow Turban leaders emerged to command local rebellions that operated independently of the original organizational structure. The fragmentation of rebel leadership made it impossible for imperial forces to achieve decisive victory through the elimination of key individuals. The suppression of the main Yellow Turban armies required nearly a year of sustained military operations that consumed enormous resources and revealed the extent to which imperial military capabilities had been stretched by the crisis. The imperial armies that achieved final victory over the rebels had suffered heavy casualties and were exhausted by prolonged campaigning in difficult conditions. Many of the generals who had commanded these forces had developed personal loyalties among their troops that were stronger than their allegiance to the imperial government, creating the foundation for the warlordism that would characterize the empire's final decades. The emergence of regional warlords as the dominant political force in post-rebellion China represented a fundamental transformation of imperial authority that would prove irreversible despite various attempts to restore centralized control. The military commanders who had gained prominence during the Yellow Turban campaigns retained control over their armies and began to operate as independent political actors who acknowledged imperial authority only when it served their immediate interests. These warlords controlled substantial territories, commanded significant military forces, and possessed the administrative capabilities necessary to govern their domains without imperial supervision. Dong Zhuo's seizure of the imperial capital in 189 AD marked the beginning of the final phase of Han dynastic collapse, as the most powerful warlord eliminated his rivals and established direct control over the imperial government. Dong Zhuo had distinguished himself during the Yellow Turban campaigns and had subsequently been appointed to command frontier forces in the northwest, where his harsh methods and personal ambition had created a military organization that was loyal to him personally rather than to imperial authority. His march on Luoyang was ostensibly undertaken to restore order following the death of Emperor Ling and the succession dispute between rival court factions, but his actions quickly revealed his intention to rule the empire through puppet emperors who would legitimize his personal authority. The deposition of Emperor Shao and the installation of Emperor Xian demonstrated Dong Zhuo's complete contempt for imperial legitimacy and traditional governmental procedures. The 9-year-old Emperor Shao was murdered after ruling for only 5 months, while his younger brother Liu Xi was placed on the throne as Emperor Xian, despite being only 8 years old. This manipulation of imperial succession eliminated any pretense that legitimate dynastic authority remained intact and revealed that effective power now resided with military commanders who possessed sufficient force to impose their will on the imperial court. Dong Zhuo's administration of the imperial government combined brutal suppression of opposition with systematic exploitation of imperial resources for personal enrichment. The warlord ordered the execution of officials who questioned his authority, while appointing his supporters to key positions throughout the central government. His forces looted the imperial treasury and confiscated private wealth to fund continued military operations, while his arbitrary taxation and requisition policies created additional hardship for populations that were still recovering from the effects of natural disasters and rebellion. The coalition that formed against Dong Zhuo in 190 AD included many of the regional warlords who had emerged during the Yellow Turban period and represented the first major attempt to coordinate military action against the usurper. The coalition was nominally led by Yuan Shao, whose family had held high positions in the imperial government for several generations, and who possessed both political legitimacy and substantial military resources. However, the participating warlords were motivated primarily by their own ambitions rather than by genuine commitment to imperial restoration, and their cooperation was limited to the immediate objective of eliminating Dong Zhuo's threat to their independent authority. The military campaigns against Dong Zhuo revealed both the tactical capabilities that various warlord armies had developed and the strategic limitations that prevented effective coordination among the coalition forces. Individual warlords commanded professional armies that were well equipped and experienced in warfare, but their reluctance to subordinate their forces to unified command prevented the coalition from achieving decisive military advantages over Dong Zhuo's centralized forces. The siege of Luoyang demonstrated the coalition's military potential, but also revealed the political divisions that would ultimately prevent successful imperial restoration. Dong Zhuo's decision to abandon Luoyang and relocate the imperial court to Chang'an represented both a strategic withdrawal and a final act of destructive spite against the empire he could no longer control. His forces systematically destroyed the Eastern Han capital, burning palace complexes, governmental buildings, and residential areas while forcing the population to relocate westward. The destruction of Luoyang eliminated centuries of architectural and cultural achievements, while symbolizing the complete breakdown of imperial authority and the end of the unified governmental system that had sustained Chinese civilization. The assassination of Dong Zhuo in 192 AD by his adopted son Lu Bu eliminated the most powerful individual warlord, but failed to restore imperial authority or prevent the continued fragmentation of political control throughout the empire. The death of the tyrant was followed by factional fighting among his supporters and the emergence of new warlord coalitions that competed for control over the imperial government and the territories that Dong Zhuo had dominated. Emperor Xian remained a powerless figurehead whose nominal authority was claimed by various warlords as justification for their political ambitions. The gradual consolidation of warlord territories into larger domains, controlled by the most successful military commanders, created the foundation for the tripartite division that would characterize post-Han China. Cao Cao emerged as the dominant figure in northern China through his systematic elimination of rival warlords and his establishment of effective governmental institutions in territories under his control. His success was based on superior administrative organization, more disciplined military forces, and political skills that enabled him to attract capable subordinates and maintain loyalty among diverse groups of supporters. Sun Ce and later his brother Sun Quan established control over the Yangtze River Valley and southern territories through naval superiority and effective exploitation of the region's economic resources. The Sun family's power was based on control of water transportation networks that were essential for commercial activity in southern China, while their military organization emphasized naval warfare and amphibious operations that were well suited to the geographic conditions of their domain. Their political system combined direct administrative control over core territories with tributary relationships with local leaders in more remote areas. Liu Bei's gradual accumulation of territory in southwestern China represented the most explicitly legitimist challenge to the post-Han political order, as he claimed descent from the Han imperial family and positioned himself as the rightful heir to imperial authority. His political and military organization was smaller and less resource-rich than those of his major rivals, but his claim to dynastic legitimacy attracted supporters who remained committed to imperial restoration and provided him with a distinct political identity that differentiated his cause from the purely pragmatic ambitions of other warlords. The Battle of Red Cliffs in 208 AD marked the definitive end of any possibility for reunification under a single warlord and established the military balance that would characterize the Three Kingdoms period. Cao Cao's attempt to eliminate his southern rivals through a massive naval campaign demonstrated both his military capabilities and the strategic limitations that prevented any single warlord from achieving complete victory. The defeat of his forces by the Sun-Liu alliance confirmed the tripartite division of China and established the territorial boundaries that would persist for decades. The formal end of the Han dynasty came in 220 AD when Emperor Xian abdicated in favour of Cao Cao's son Cao Pi, who established the Wei dynasty and formally terminated 4 centuries of Liu family rule. The abdication ceremony was conducted according to traditional protocols that emphasized the peaceful transfer of the mandate of heaven from the exhausted Han dynasty to the vigorous Wei regime. However, the ceremony's legitimacy was immediately challenged by Liu Bei, who proclaimed himself emperor of the Shu Han dynasty and claimed to represent the continuation of legitimate Han rule, and by Sun Quan, who established the Wu dynasty and asserted his own claim to imperial authority. The collapse of Han unity and the emergence of the Three Kingdoms represented not merely a political transition, but a fundamental transformation of Chinese civilization that would influence the empire's development for centuries. The unified governmental system that had sustained imperial authority across vast territories and diverse populations was replaced by competing regional powers that developed distinct political cultures and institutional arrangements. The economic integration that had characterized the Han Empire was disrupted by territorial divisions and military conflicts that reduced commercial activity and technological exchange between different regions. The intellectual and cultural consequences of dynastic collapse included the fragmentation of scholarly traditions and the emergence of regional variations in educational practices and literary development. The Imperial Academy system that had provided standardized training for governmental officials was replaced by various local institutions that reflected the political priorities and cultural preferences of different warlord regimes. The historical consciousness that had been maintained through imperial chronicles and official records was disrupted by the destruction of archives and the displacement of scholarly communities. The military innovations that emerged during the warlord period included new tactical doctrines, improved weapons technology, and organizational reforms that reflected the competitive pressures of continuous warfare between rival powers. The professional military forces that characterized the Three Kingdoms period were generally more capable and better equipped than the imperial armies of the late Han period, but their effectiveness was limited by the reduced economic resources available to individual warlords and by the strategic constraints imposed by territorial division. The social and economic changes that accompanied political fragmentation included the acceleration of population movements, the disruption of traditional agricultural systems, and the emergence of new forms of social organization adapted to conditions of continuous military conflict. The breakdown of imperial authority eliminated many of the legal and institutional protections that had regulated relationships between different social classes, while the demands of warfare created new opportunities for social mobility based on military service and administrative competence. The Han Dynasty's collapse marked the end of the first great era of Chinese imperial unity and initiated a period of division that would last for nearly 4 centuries before reunification was achieved under the Sui dynasty in 589 AD. The institutional innovations, cultural achievements, and territorial expansion that had characterized Han rule established patterns and precedents that would influence Chinese civilization throughout its subsequent development, while the dynasty's ultimate failure provided cautionary lessons about the challenges of maintaining unified authority over vast and diverse populations. The transformation of the unified Han Empire into the competing three kingdoms represented both the conclusion of an extraordinary chapter in Chinese history and the beginning of new political and cultural developments that would shape the empire's future evolution.